Subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on lawfare. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. Does anyone believe if President Trump wasn't running for president that he would be facing 4 criminal trials? Fani Willis announced her investigation in February of 2021, but didn't bring charges until 2.5 years later after President Trump announced he was running for president. Attorney General Garland named Jack Smith special counsel 3 days after President Trump announces that he's running for president. And Alvin Bragg said he could not see a world, quote, he could not see a world in which he would indict President Trump and call Michael Cohen as a prosecution witness. But that's exactly what he did after President Trump announces he's running for president. Alvin Bragg brings a case that the Department of Justice wouldn't, that the Federal Elections Commission wouldn't bring, that his predecessor, Cy Vance, wouldn't bring, and as Alvin Bragg himself said, he wouldn't bring, but then he did after President Trump announced he was running for president. Some might call this all election interference. Think about it. Mr. Bragg is charging President Trump with conspiracy to impact the 2016 election. Ms. Willis and Mr. Smith are charging President Trump with a conspiracy to interfere with the 2020 election. Seems to me the conspiracy is between Bragg, Smith, and Willis working to interfere with the 2024 race. Of course, none of this is new. 2016, government spied on President Trump's campaign. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take this committee's word for it. John Durham said it. Clinton campaign paid the law firm Perkins Coie, who hired Fusion GPS, who hired Christopher Steele, a foreigner, who talked to other foreigners, who put together the fake dossier, which became the basis for the FBI to spy on President Trump's campaign. The basis for a whole investigation where we saw text messages back and forth from folks on the investigation saying, "We'll stop Trump." Then, of course, it was the Mueller investigation. 19 lawyers, 41 FBI agents, $30 million to find nothing. No conspiracy, no coordination, none whatsoever. Then it was impeachment. Anonymous whistleblower with no firsthand knowledge. He was biased against President Trump, who worked for Joe Biden. Talks about a phone call and they impeached the President of the United States. Then they raided his home. Broke every protocol, every normal procedure. Again, don't take our word for it. Stephen D'Antuono, FBI Assistant Director of the Washington Field Office, told us this in his deposition. Then, of course, they tried the 14th Amendment. We'll just keep him off the ballot. The easiest way to win is not to let your opponent play. That's what they tried to do. Thank goodness the Supreme Court said no to that. 9-0, they said no to that. And then, of course, after all that, after he's a candidate, as I said, we get all these cases. In Georgia, Fani Willis hires her boyfriend, who travels to D.C. on the taxpayer dime, meets with White House officials, January 6th committee, all in an effort to target President Trump. In New York, gag orders placed on President Trump by a partisan judge whose daughter is a Democrat fundraiser, while Michael Cohen, convicted perjurer, is allowed to post anything he wants on social media, say whatever he wants. Not to mention the guy who's the lead prosecutor for Alvin Bragg, Mr. Colangelo, who worked for Letitia James, then worked for the Justice Department, then went back to New York to work for Alvin Bragg. And in Florida, we learned that Jack Smith altered the order of the classified documents he seized. The physical documents don't match up with the scanned documents. Jack Smith didn't properly handle the documents he said President Trump didn't properly handle. Jack Smith mishandled classified information, all while charging President Trump with, quote, mishandling classified information. You can't make this up. Some would call that tampering with evidence. Today's hearing is about how the law is being used to target political opponents. It's truly about the weaponization of government, truly about what this committee has been focused on for this Congress. And obviously, President Trump is example number one. It's about the double standard, one set of rules for the politically connected, the other set for the people they want to target. But maybe most important, it's about where does all this go? Where does it all go? Because if they can do it to a president, they can do it to anybody. Any one of us, any of our constituents, any American they want to. And that's what's frightening. That's what's truly frightening. So I want to thank our witnesses for being here and talking about this most critical issue, how the government, how the agencies, how the law is being turned on people that they politically disagree with. With that, I yield to the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands for her opening statement, the ranking member, Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone that is here with us. Thank you for joining. 2 weeks ago in this same room, we watched as the Republican majority attempted to use the congressional hearing process to intervene in an ongoing Supreme Court case. Republicans here did so by suggesting that they were concerned about how social media companies are bullied by the federal government. In truth, these arguments are operating in the interests of securing an open season where Russia and China can destabilize our democracy at will in the 2024 election. By my Republican counterparts causing people to bully social media companies, they want to allow any and all foreign adversaries to dump lies and misinformation on social media in support of a would-be fascist former president. And now you're back. Why are we back this time? We're here because former President Trump is on trial in New York. That's why we're here. On Monday and Tuesday of this week, his former attorney, Michael Cohen, delivered devastating testimony implicating former President Trump in a hush money payment scheme. His former attorney even had audio recordings of Trump talking about those payments. Whether we think the trial in New York is a good case or a bad case, the truth remains that the facts in the case don't help Donald Trump. We're here because Donald Trump knows that the evidence against him is plentiful and that the testimony of his literal, as my teenage daughter says, literal partner in crime in this case is harmful to his criminal defense and his political prospects. It's not that complicated. The truth hurts. And here's one. We all know that the former president exacts loyalty from all of his followers, and especially GOP officials and those that work for him. Blind loyalty. And this case is no different. Many of them have hightailed it to New York City to show him that they are with him and standing with Donald Trump. Trump, in turn, demands that every Republican official serve him like the incorrigible, degenerate, spoiled brat that he is, and use their positions to aid his criminal defense. And even after the embarrassment of recent hearings today, Donald Trump and his cronies don't think that the chairman is doing enough. We're here today simply because Donald Trump's sycophants have been taunting the members of this committee on the GOP side and judiciary Republicans for not doing anything tangible to defend Trump against our judicial system. Lackeys like Natalie Winters, a Trump loyalist and an executive producer for Steve Bannon's show, have been mocking Chairman Jordan's leadership of the committee openly. As you can see up there, when the House Judiciary tweeted, "Imagine actually believing Michael Cohen," she retweeted and said, "Imagine actually believing at Judiciary GOP will do anything about it. Just as one example, on Monday, she put that tweet up, and then Fox's Maria Bartiromo and Steve Bannon himself have gotten into the act. And here they are.
Why aren't you being louder about this? Why aren't I hearing anything from this committee? I had to just ask you about it, okay? Just let me be clear. Viewers are sick and tired of hearings. They're sick and tired of letters. They're sick and tired of hearing complaints. They want action. President Trump is in a trial all day long, every day in New York City. Where is this committee of weaponization, and what are you doing about it? I just spoke with Kevin Hassett, the former chairman of the White House Economics Council, and he said, make no mistake, if we see President Trump go to jail because he violated this gag order, markets will react. Okay, Congressman, we're losing the country. So with all due respect, I'm not blaming you specifically, but it's not enough to set up a committee that's called the weaponization of federal government. That's not doing it for anybody. We want to hear more from you. We want to hear action. We want to know what the heck is going on in this New York trial where nobody can seem to come up with a crime.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm specifically doing.
Okay. No, I don't need to hear. I don't need to hear a backbencher. I'm sure you're a good guy, and I'm sure you're trying to do a lot, but it's not, as Maria Bartiromo says. And man, she lit him up.
We all heard her. It's not enough to set up a committee just called the weaponization of the federal government. That's not doing it. We want action. And that's why we're here today. We're here at the beck and call of Trump fanatics and talking heads on cable and internet talk shows in the MAGA world who, like Bartiromo and Bannon, have goaded this committee to act. Because the purpose of this select committee is, in fact, to be an arm of the Trump campaign and take his orders. And yes, we know your mad things are not going your way. Republicans are upset because the Justice Department has determined that it must prosecute Donald Trump because the allegations against President Biden amount to nothing, both at the Justice Department and even in this chamber in the House, by the very committees Republicans created to investigate President Biden. This committee and Republicans are mad because Robert Hur, himself a Republican political appointee, fully and completely exonerated President Biden while specifically outlining, a Republican appointee, outlining the reasons that Donald Trump deserved to be prosecuted and President Biden does not. They're mad because he had the gumption, I'll use that word, to tell the truth as to what facts have been shown Trump to have. The committee wants to allege the fact that Donald Trump repeatedly, and this was a discussion just in the opening statement, talking about Jack Smith and what he did with classified information. But the fact is that Trump didn't just mishandle classified information, he hid classified information and legally pertinent documents from the FBI and other law enforcement. Donald Trump ordered his aides to destroy documents and then repeatedly lied about doing so. Donald Trump even tricked his own lawyers into making false statements on his behalf, potentially implicating those lawyers in his criminal schemes. That's why Donald Trump is currently facing 40 charges in a federal court in Florida for knowingly mishandling, withholding, hiding, lying, destroying classified documents in a way that put our national security at severe risk. That's why he's facing 34 charges in New York State Court for falsifying business records and making hush money payments to catch and kill information that would be harmful to his reputation and his presidential campaign. That's why he's charged with 4 felony counts, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding for attempting to overturn the 2020 election. And that's why, despite the machinations and attempted character assassination of a prosecutor in Georgia, that he's charged with 10 counts for attempting to intimidate election officials while trying to force them to accept a slate of false electors, again, part of his efforts to overturn an election. Trump is charged in these cases because there is sufficient evidence to reasonably believe that he committed almost 100 serious crimes. In this country, no one should be above the law. So just for a little legal lesson, I strongly suspect the defendant may be watching, or his minions, or others. No, Donald, even a president can't shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in broad daylight and get away with it. That's not going to happen. To my Republican counterparts in the majority, you claim that you want to fight a weaponized executive branch. You do so by calling in far-right witnesses to spew conspiracies about a deep state, or by calling witnesses who have testified under oath that they literally are missing parts of their brain, and another who self-identified as a time traveler from Canada. That, my friends, is the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. To be the party of law enforcement and be led by a man currently facing 100 serious charges. We fail to understand that we are playing white knights for the most radical fringes of our society, while making frequent references to Big Brother, no less. They themselves are growing embodiment of George Orwell's 1984. Now, I know I've said it before, and if people don't know, I've been a Republican. I was a Republican appointee when some of my counterparts were still in high school. I served a Republican president. But this is not the Republican Party. This is a cult of personality where Donald Trump exercises totalitarian control. This is a subcommittee that intimidates witnesses who disagree with them, questioning Americans' loyalty to their country if they don't support Donald Trump's agenda. This subcommittee is using its platform to bully American people into believing falsehoods. Falsehoods which serve little purpose other than to scare everyday Americans, spread confusion, and attempt to re-elect Donald Trump. It's a subcommittee that is taking orders from a disgraced former president. I see members rolling their eyes, they're all upset. You don't believe me? Think I'm making up that Trump directs the actions of this select committee? You think that everyone is not jumping through hoops to please Donald Trump? Follow the facts. Who was among the select few Donald Trump called on January 6th while encouraging thousands of rioters to overtake the Capitol and steal the election? Individuals from this select committee. Members here have refused to answer a subpoena related to that call from Trump and the attack on the Capitol. Members of Congress said at rally after rally, I'm busting my tail to get Donald Trump reelected. We need to make sure Donald Trump wins. It's so important that we stay engaged and help Donald Trump get back the White House. That's what members of this committee have said. And it's our duty to call out bias and hidden agendas of the committee. It's a sham, solely designed to serve, as like we have said before, as the legislative arm of Donald Trump's re-election campaign. That's what this select committee is. This select committee's efforts are transparent. And you know what else? They're expensive. Last hearing, we talked about the $20 million this committee has spent already on this witch hunt. And they still have nothing to show for it, which explains why we're frantically calling last-minute hearings over and over again to distract from Trump's criminal trials. Just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. Anything to try to keep Donald Trump happy. What a strategy, and what an expensive failure. I've tried to use this committee for the good of Americans. I've talked to the chairman and to others about examining moments in our nation's history when the powers of the federal government have been abused. We have seen reports that the IRS has a real problem of racial bias in its audits. A year ago, the IRS admitted that Black taxpayers are audited at disproportionately higher rates than other racial groups. Are we talking about that weaponization? Is there a discussion about that or any other hearing beyond defending Donald Trump and his election? No. I applaud the DOJ for not giving into political pressure and following the facts where they lead. No one is above the law, no matter how hard this committee tries to make it otherwise. Thank you, and I yield back.
All other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses. Mr. Robert Costello is partner at David Hoff, Hutcher, and Citron. He was previously a partner at Levy, Tolman, and Costello and served as the Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Mr. James Trusty is a member of the IFRA Law. He previously served as prosecutor for 27 years, including as the Chief of the Organized Crime Section at the Department of Justice and as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. Mr. Gene Hamilton is the Executive Director, Executive Vice President, General Counsel at the American First Legal Foundation. He previously served as counselor to the U.S. Attorney General, Senior Counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and as a Senate aide. Ms. Jill Wine-Banks is an attorney and MSNBC legal analyst. She previously served as a federal prosecutor in the Illinois Attorney General's office and as a General Counsel of the United States Army under President Carter. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You can be seated. Thank you. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety, and accordingly, we ask you to summarize your testimony as best you can, and we will just move right down the list. We will start, or right in the line, I should say, we will start with Mr. Costello. You make sure you hit your mic and pull that, turn your mic on and pull it real close. No, hit the button there. It should hit the button. See the button there in front? Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. My name is Bob Costello. I've been an attorney for 51 years, and I'm the former Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, where I was Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division. I am not now, nor have I ever been, an attorney for Donald Trump, any of his family members, or any of his businesses. I've represented quite a number of high-profile individuals, but never Donald Trump. During the period April 2018 to July 2018, I represented Michael Cohen. Today, I can talk to you about what Michael Cohen told my law partner and me because Michael Cohen waived the attorney-client privilege at the request of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The reason was Michael Cohen had pled guilty to 8 felony counts in the Southern District and was seeking to lessen his sentence. And he thought he could be clever by going into the U.S. Attorney's Office and lying about cooperation. Michael Cohen went to the U.S. Attorney's Office and accused Rudy Giuliani and myself of conspiring to obstruct justice by tampering with a witness, namely Michael Cohen. The story, which they were floating at the time and his lawyers put out in the various newspapers, was that we had dangled a pardon under Michael Cohen's nose in order to keep him quiet so that he wouldn't testify against Donald Trump. When I received the call from the U.S. Attorney's Office saying, Bob, we'd like to talk to you about your representation of Michael Cohen, I said to them, can I presume that you guys are sitting there with a copy of the waiver of the attorney-client privilege? And they said, you presume correctly. I told them to scan it over to me, and once I received it, I'd be delighted to talk to them. And I did. I went down to 1 St. Andrews Plaza with a lawyer who had been the chief of the criminal division when I was deputy chief, Tom Fitzpatrick. And on the way into the office, he said to me, Bob, aren't you nervous? I said, what for? I'm going to tell the truth, and I have documentary evidence that corroborates me 6 ways from Sunday. I said, there's nothing to be nervous about. And in fact, I said, I'll bet you $10 I'll have these people laughing within 15 minutes. I won the bet. I went up and I sat with 2 assistant U.S. attorneys, Tom McKay and Nick Rose, as well as 2 FBI agents whose names, unfortunately, I don't remember. We had a grand old time. I explained our entire history with Michael Cohen through emails and text messages. I explained the many, many lies that Michael Cohen told us. Most especially, I told them that when we first met Michael Cohen in April of 2018, keeping in mind now that I read Michael Cohen's testimony from yesterday's trial in New York on the way down on the train, and virtually every statement he made about me was another lie. A lie that can be proven not just by me denying it, but by myself, Jeff Citron, or Rudy Giuliani, or emails or text messages. Virtually every statement that he made. What he tries to do is he cherry picks certain emails or text messages and tries to make them look like something else. The story he told yesterday was that Rudy Giuliani and I were somehow conspiring to try and keep him quiet, to try and keep him from flipping. That's the term we use in the trade for cooperating. That's ridiculous. The first day that we met with Michael Cohen at the Regency Hotel, at his request, and there's email correspondence that show this, we went up there. I had never met Michael Cohen before. I didn't have any idea who he was or what sort of problem he was in. I saw this guy in a conference room at the Regency Hotel marching back and forth like a tiger in a cage. He was absolutely manic. He looked like he hadn't slept in 4 or 5 days. And he kept on, he knew my partner, Jeff Citron, for 10 years. I didn't know the guy. He kept on pounding on the table throughout his speeches that day. Guys, I want you to know, I will do whatever the F I have to do. I will never spend 1 day in jail. He had to say that at least 10 times, maybe 20. It was his constant litany as he walked back and forth. So I said, Michael, sit down. We need to discuss what's going on here. He told us about the raid, that his offices had been raided, his home had been raided. And he said, I didn't do anything wrong, guys. I don't know what they're looking for. And I said, Michael, the people in the Southern District of New York are very smart people. They got a search warrant for a lawyer's office. You can't do that just by going to the U.S. attorney. You need to go to Maine Justice and get approval from Maine Justice. You need to show them that you have proof that a crime has been committed and that the evidence of that crime is going to exist at the site to be examined. I said, so Michael, these people think that you did something wrong. What is it? I said, this is protected by attorney-client privilege, and it was until he waived the attorney-client privilege. I swear to God, Bob, I didn't do anything wrong. In fact, I'm cooperating with the special counsel. I'm cooperating with Congress. Of course, he forgot to tell us that he lied to Congress, but that was part and parcel of the way Michael Cohen is. So I sat him down and I said, look, Michael, clearly here, you're not the target. Nobody's ever heard of Michael Cohen, but you are the lawyer for President Trump, and clearly that's their target. And let me explain to you how things work. When they get a search warrant, they're looking to gather evidence. They already have evidence against you for something, but you haven't told us what it is. And they are going to roll over you. You're just a bump in the road. Their target is Donald Trump. So I want you to think carefully now. And by the way, up to this point, he had told us when he introduced himself to us that 2 nights before, he was on the roof of the hotel, of the Regency Hotel, seriously considering jumping off, committing suicide, because he couldn't handle the pressure of the legal problems that he saw coming his way. And what he wanted to find out from us that day was his escape route. That's what he called it. Guys, you have to tell me what my escape route is. What can I do to get out of this? And I did. My obligation as a lawyer at that point in time was to explain to him what his options were. Clearly, one of his options was to cooperate. And I said to him, I said, Michael, the way this works is if you have truthful information about Donald Trump, that's clearly what they're looking for, I can have all your legal problems solved by the end of the week. His response, I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything on Donald Trump. I said, Michael, I want you to think carefully about this. I probably came back to this subject 10 or 20 times during the 2-hour period. Every time I brought it up, every time he answered, I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything on Donald Trump. I said, Michael, whatever you have has to be truthful. If you think you can go in there and tell these people lies, you're crazy. It's going to backfire on you. You can't do that. So do you have anything on Donald Trump? Probably the 5th or the 6th time I got around to doing that, he said, well, I know that money is missing from the Trump inaugural ball. I said, is Donald Trump involved in that? No. Does Donald Trump know anything about that? No. I said, Michael, that's useless. You're not going anywhere with that. You asked me for your escape route. I'm telling you your escape route. All you have to do is be truthful if you have some real evidence on Donald Trump. His litany was the same all the time. I don't have anything on Donald Trump. This is exactly the opposite to what I saw him say on TV he was telling the grand jury in Manhattan and the district attorney's office. He said, I went in there, I believe, if my memory is correct, 20 times, including 2 appearances in the grand jury, 18 times preparation sessions with the DA's office. I was sitting at home listening to this, and I said, that's nonsense. That's not what he told Jeff Citron and myself. And I decided at that point in time, I've got to make it known to both the defense and the prosecution what the real story is, who this guy really is. So I provided all this material to Donald Trump's lawyers, and I provided it to the Manhattan DA's office. And I asked for a meeting with District Attorney Bragg, because I wanted to go in there, let him look me in the eye, and let me explain all of the stuff that we had on Michael Cohen that showed that he's an inveterate liar. The guy can't be trusted. Bragg turned me down. But what he did say was, I'll let you have a meeting with the assistant district attorneys. Now, when the
Mr.
Trump
Costello,
people,
we need you just to
I'm sorry, when the Trump people
finish up quickly.
heard about all of this, they insisted, as was their right under the law, that the DA put me before the grand jury.
Right.
So that I was scheduled for a Monday. On the Friday before, I gave the DA's office the courtesy of a Zoom conference for about an hour and a half. 8 assistant district attorneys and me on the other end. I explained, they didn't really ask me any questions. They just said, what do you want to say? Nice warm greeting for somebody who's trying to show them the right path quietly and privately so that they could correct their error before they made it. Here's what happened.
We'll stop there, Mr. Costello. We'll get back to you during the questions, okay?
Did I run out of my time already?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. That's
But
fine.
I had 8 minutes. This says I have 138 to go, or is I'm 138 over?
138 over.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, point of order.
Yeah.
Will the witnesses all be given 7, 8 minutes? What is that?
Yeah.
It's usually 5, so we didn't know that in advance to be able to
We're going to give him a
tell
little
our
extra
witness.
time. I gave you 14.
But she didn't have time to prepare 8 minutes of testimony,
Well,
opening statement.
She's a smart lawyer. She can probably ad lib for a few minutes if she'd
Well,
like, but that's
we'd like
totally
it
up to
to
her.
be something more than ad lib, as we just heard.
We
or
listened to
testifying.
you talk for 14 minutes and
That's
and
called
14
an opening
seconds.
statement. I'm
I
allowed
know,
to
and
talk as long as I
And
want.
I was fine. I let you go 14 minutes and 14 seconds.
You have to let me go for 14 minutes
That's
if that's
exactly
what
right.
I want to
Exactly.
do. But
Exactly right. Mr.
you could
Trustee,
let
you
us
are
have-
recognized for your opening
The
statement.
courtesy of advance notice would have been helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Jim Trusty. I've been an attorney for 35 years. I spent my first 20 as a local and federal prosecutor in Maryland, and in both roles, I was fortunate enough to be involved in some fairly complex or weighty prosecutions. It starts with the usual of misdemeanors and routine felonies, but I was able to do a no-body child murder case, as well as numerous RICO cases against MS-13, and I personally led 3 different death penalty prosecutions as a federal prosecutor. In 2011, I moved over to D.C., against my better judgment maybe, but I came over to the department to work at Main Justice with some other folks that I knew from Maryland and became the chief of the organized crime and gang section, which was a fascinating job that I enjoyed for about 6.5 years. I was able to manage a group of prosecutors that handled international, national, and regional organized crime cases against everything from MS-13 to Barrio Azteca, the mafia, and international white-collar conspiracies. And I was also, during this time, a senior member of the Attorney General's Death Penalty Review Committee, helping the Attorney General decide whether to pursue the death penalty against folks like the Boston Marathon bomber and the Charleston church shooter, among other numerous lower-profile cases. If my memory serves, I served under 7 different Attorney Generals. And in 2017, I left for IFRA Law, a boutique litigation shop, where I've represented everything from international gaming institutions to white-collar executives to human trafficking victims. And in 2022, for about a 1-year period, President Donald J. Trump. On August 8th of 2022, I became deeply involved in the Mar-a-Lago case involving President Trump, and I've given significant detail in the written statement, which I can't even begin to fully broach in a summary, but I'll try to hit some highlights. I wrote that statement. I took the time to write that statement because I think it's important for you and for the American people to have specific evidence, to have details to support the conclusion that the Department of Justice is acting in a weaponized fashion when it comes to a candidate for the presidency of the United States, that this is, in fact, lawfare in its rawest form. The Mar-a-Lago case is plagued with singular moments where prosecutors took incredibly aggressive and I would say prejudicial steps, the likes of which I had never seen in 35 years of practice on both sides of the aisle. The politicization actually began with the National Archives and Records Administration, whose director ended up making a historic and first-time criminal referral based on his stated concern, his overstated concern, that he had received documents from President Trump that were in fact marked classified within 15 boxes given to him in January of 2022. The reality is every modern day president has also turned over boxes or groups of materials that included documents marked classified. But in this case, NARA acted alarmed, and recent litigation in the Southern District of Florida has suggested that in fact the White House helped spur this referral on to the Department of Justice. Once in the hands of the Department of Justice, the lead prosecutor reportedly, according to the Washington Post, fought with the FBI to immediately jump to the perch of doing a criminal search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. He was talked out of that apparently in a heated conversation and still relied on a criminal enforcement tool, which was a grand jury subpoena, to begin this process of gathering documents by force and by use of criminal sanction. For brevity's sake, I'm just going to highlight 3 examples of what I think are singular treatment of President Trump that I document in my written submission. The first is the abusive process in grand jury. And again, grand jury is usually fairly opaque to the defense side. We don't see everything that happens there, but we had some glimpses of the behavior, of the threats, of the conduct of prosecutors. And the one I would highlight today was the presentation of Tim Parlatore, a former Trump lawyer as well, a friend of mine, who went into grand jury and was asked by the Department of Justice attorney, I think 48 times, I might be off by 2 or 3, but 48 times he was asked questions that clearly led to an invocation of attorney-client privilege. Those questions are unethical on their face. A prosecutor should not be in front of a grand jury purposefully eliciting a known privilege, but they were comfortable with this in this setting in Washington, D.C. that we were in. And after 48 times, including Mr. Parlatore telling the prosecutor at times, what you're doing is unethical, you need to stop, she said, well, if your client is so cooperative, why won't he just waive his privilege? Now that's kind of a nice political point or a layman's point, but for lawyers and for people that worked in the Department of Justice, they know that is flat out unethical. That the idea that you would try to draw a negative inference from a legitimate invocation of counsel is an outrageous moment, and that's just one that we had visibility into. Secondly, I would point to Jack Smith's near obsession with having a, quote, speedy trial in the January 6th case. You know, the speedy trial right is derived historically from a defendant who is incarcerated, who has the Pyrrhic victory of going to trial a year or 2 later and being acquitted. And the question, of course, becomes, well, what do I do with that free time I just served for a year or 2? That's why we have a constitutional and a statutory speedy trial right, and it is invoked by defendants or waived by defendants every day in federal court. What you don't see every day in federal court is a federal prosecutor for a non-incarcerated defendant insisting on having a speedy trial, when the Department of Justice, in fact, has its own guidelines to avoid charging decisions and trials on the eve of elections. Instead, we had Jack Smith pushing with all his might, pushing the Supreme Court to expedite a hearing that was still in front of the D.C. Court of Appeals, and only angrily losing that battle, apparently, when the Supreme Court took up the question of immunity. The third thing that I would point out from my summary is something that came from a respected lawyer in Washington, D.C., who represented Walt Nauta, who I think the Department of Justice viewed as kind of the keys to the kingdom in their investigation into President Trump, a person that they were intent on flipping at all costs and eventually charged. And this lawyer was the subject of an extortionate ploy. I have no other way to phrase it than that. He was brought in very early into his representation to the Department of Justice, where he met with Jay Bratt and about 5 or 6 other prosecutors in the room. Mr. Bratt had a folder open that appeared to be information not about Mr. Nauta, but about Mr. Woodward, the lawyer. And he looked at this, according to Mr. Woodward, and said, I see that you have a pending application for judgeship with President Biden. I don't take you to be a Trump lawyer. I would hate to see you blow it. You need to flip Walt Nauta against President Trump. That sequence of events, which has not been fully investigated to my knowledge or fully litigated, but has been presented and has been publicized, is a devastating indictment of the willingness of a Department of Justice attorney with others around him to engage in essentially extortion or bribery or whatever you want to call it, or obstruction. The enforcers of obstruction, in fact, were willing to obstruct justice because of an ends justify the means mentality. So that brings me to just talk for a couple of minutes about what I think the cost of lawfare is and really why I'm here, which is not for any sort of personal gain or political moment for me. Lawfare, and in its form with the Department of Justice in criminal cases, is an effort to manipulate law as a way of targeting an individual who's despised by the user. Justice and the concept of rule of law rely on honest cops and principled prosecutors to follow evidence and to make impartial determinations as to accountability. It is evidence-driven, not animus-driven, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Mr. Trustee. Appreciate that. Mr. Hamilton, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on this important matter. The American people and American society have flourished for nearly 250 years, not because of some accident, but because of the grace of God and the brilliance of our founding fathers, who created a system uniquely designed to foster the ideal conditions for individual liberty, human success, and societal flourishing. But the system was always predicated upon the continued existence of a just and moral society, where action in the pursuit of justice and morality would counteract the worst of human ambition. It was also predicated upon the continued existence of a federal government strong enough to do what the governed had consented to in the Constitution, but not so omnipotent as to be able to undermine the liberties of the individuals and the states. It was also predicated upon a recognition that the concentration of power in the hands of a few was a recipe for tyranny. And of course, the mere existence of words on paper alone does not guarantee any individual's rights. Rather, it has been action taken by principled people that fulfills those guarantees and secures those individual liberties. Put differently, in America, thanks to the wisdom and foresight of our founding fathers, our Davids have always had a chance against our Goliaths. But sadly, we live in unprecedented times where the concentration of power in the federal government, particularly in the executive branch under President Biden's leadership, has served as the fulcrum through which other powers in society oppress the individual and undermine the foundation upon which our national success resides. The Biden administration, and most notably the Department of Justice, appears to have embarked on a journey of political persecution of those with whom it disagrees, with the end result being the total social, economic, and political domination of the populace. And beyond its attempts to silence and imprison its political opposition, the Biden administration has engaged in an obsessive-compulsive campaign of division and spoliation of the public fisc based on the immutable characteristics of American citizens. Its efforts are incessant and relentless. We live in a time in which any attempt even to describe the current state of affairs gets labeled as disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and worthy of censorship. Or worse, content worthy of subjecting an individual to criminal prosecution. Memes are prosecuted. Business leaders are subjected to intrusive investigation solely because of their outspoken views. Actual peaceful protesters are imprisoned. And all the while, violent and repeat criminals run free in major cities across the United States. In this new and unprecedented world, everyone, including a former president of the United States, is threatened by the federal Leviathan and private elites who seek total domination and control over every aspect of human life. The political persecution of President Trump by the Biden administration is unlawful, unprecedented, and un-American. These prosecutions must end. But make no mistake, the American people must understand The intended impact of the administration's conspiracy extends far beyond any personal consequence to President Trump. Instead, the intended result is to chill dissent, silence speech, and convince the American people that the weight of the federal government can be forcefully weaponized against anyone who stands in the way. President Trump is in the administration's crosshairs to discourage anyone, now or in the future, from challenging the administration's agenda. The Biden administration must not be allowed to indict and potentially imprison its political opposition with impunity. My written statement highlights just 3 glaring problems, examples of lawfare that are being used against President Trump. Number 1, the Biden White House granted an illegal special access request to allow the Department of Justice to illegally obtain access to President Trump's records. 2, the Biden administration is prosecuting President Trump based on an erroneous and faulty interpretation of the Presidential Records Act, and actually provides individual bureaucrats with greater control over their records than President Trump. 3, the Biden administration has weaponized a white-collar criminal statute for the first time in history to attack President Trump and others. But there are so many more examples. The average American citizen residing outside of the Beltway, away from the isolated, elitist bubble where ends justifying the means seem to be a mantra for many, is tired of watching institutions they once trusted violate the law and undermine the critical components of the constitutional and social constructs that made ours the greatest country in history. The remaining issue then is what must be done. The time is now for institutional ambition to counteract institutional ambition. For Americans to stand up unafraid and unapologetic for the values that they hold dear. And for our republic to reject the radical weaponization of the executive branch. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Wine-Banks, you are recognized.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, members of the committee, thank you for letting me be here today to talk to you. My parents raised me to believe in the office of the presidency and all the members of Congress, and I still feel that way today. They encouraged me to engage in public service, and most of my career has been in that. Fresh out of law school, I joined the Department of Justice as a prosecutor in the organized crime section and carried those beliefs with me. I served a short time under President Johnson and then under Presidents Nixon and Ford. Regardless of who the president was, I knew that my job, like that of every federal prosecutor, was to pursue the truth and justice and to assure that everyone was treated equally under the law. The rules of the Department of Justice and those of the Watergate Special Prosecutor team, where I served a few years after joining the Department of Justice, required the same. Those rules require that no investigation be opened without reasonable cause, no indictment be brought without a high probability of conviction, and that prosecutors speak only through the indictment if there is one. In that process, politics and bias have no role. Those rules have not changed in the over 50 years since then. I think I am the lawyer here with the longest tenure. DOJ prosecutors weigh incriminating and exculpatory facts and analyze if those facts prove all the elements of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt before they decide to indict or not. As my mentor and my first supervisor at Justice, Chuck Ruff, said, my job was to do justice, not to win cases. And I think today's DOJ is doing exactly that. Your committee's website said today's hearing is to examine the use of lawfare tactics to weaponize the rule of law. I admit I had to look up what lawfare meant in that context. And I found out that lawfare was a use of tactics to weaponize the rule of law against opponents. I have seen no lawfare tactics in today's DOJ or in any of the special counsel's decisions regarding the cases against former President Donald Trump or its decisions about President Biden and Vice President Pence. I see no double standard, no selective prosecution, no weaponization. If we could just go back to the era of Watergate, when facts were agreed upon, when bipartisanship existed, it would be obvious why the Department of Justice was justified in investigating Trump, Biden, and Pence, but justified only in indicting former President Trump. The standards for deciding to prosecute or decline to do so were the same for President Biden, former President Trump, and former Vice President Pence. But the facts differed so greatly that the results had to be different. They were judged under the same standard, but the facts made the prosecution decision different. And let's look at the distinguishing characteristics of the case against President Biden and the one against former President Trump, in the hope that we might all agree on at least some of these facts. When NARA discovered that former President Trump possessed documents he should have returned to them when he left office, they asked him to return them. He refused. Had he voluntarily returned them, he would have avoided prosecution, as did President Biden and former Vice President Pence. Instead, Mr. Trump returned some but hid others, even from the FBI during their execution of a lawful warrant granted by a court. That added the crime of obstruction to those of espionage. That conduct shows willfulness and knowledge and constitute aggravating factors that required the special counsel to seek an indictment against the former president, as they did for Sandy Berger and General Petraeus, whose indictments demonstrate a lack of a double standard or selective prosecution. So too do the indictments not in documents cases, but in other cases against two Democratic members of Congress right now and against the president's son. In contrast, the facts of President Biden's possession of documents are very different. His staff, not NARA, found the documents, informed the president, who then had them immediately notify the proper authorities. Biden then cooperated fully with those officials. He hid nothing, allowed numerous searches of all his offices and homes without need for a warrant. He returned everything, and even during a national crisis created by the attack of Hamas on Israel, President Biden sat for lengthy interviews. The former president did none of that. He did the opposite. The special counsel investigating President Biden, Robert Hur, a Republican who Trump had appointed as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland, concluded no criminal charges were warranted and emphasized these and other factual distinctions between Trump and Biden, differences that undermined any allegation of selective prosecution, double standards, or bias. As Hur wrote, Trump is in a wholly different category than either Pence or Biden in terms of retention and concealment and destruction. In my many years of experience, nothing justifies allowing anyone to be above the law and to evade accountability for alleged criminal conduct, especially a former president who is responsible for seeing that our laws are faithfully executed. No one is above the law. Accountability is necessary for the rule of law and democracy to survive. And there is an existential danger in not proceeding where an investigation reveals facts and evidence of a crime. Doing so only emboldens future miscreants. I believe that the Department of Justice is making investigative and prosecutorial decisions solely based on the evidence and the law, not on a preconceived notion or a political agenda. I have seen no evidence to the contrary in the case against defendant Trump. He is entitled to due process and the presumption of innocence, as are all criminal defendants, no more and no less. I am thrilled to be here in your search for facts and truth. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wine-Banks, we will now proceed on the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
I was told that I had to keep to under 5 minutes, and I did that.
No, you didn't. You went 7 minutes and 2 seconds, but it was fine nonetheless. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you. It's one of those funny things about written statements. People often come and they haven't timed them. Ms. Wine-Banks, you obviously began your career, or relatively early in your career, with the Watergate investigation. Wasn't one of the major things that President Nixon was accused of, the weaponization of government, using the IRS and so on? Wasn't that part of the final impeachment draft?
Right. I was not directly involved in the impeachment,
Okay,
but in the prosecution, but you are correct.
you.
The impeachment charge misuse
So
of power.
we are exactly where you started your career, ma'am. We are seeing the weaponization. Richard Milhouse Nixon was accused, and there was plenty of evidence that he thought the IRS and other tactics would be perfectly acceptable against his political enemies. Here we are again. So one of the questions I'm going to ask, all of you are attorneys, is that correct? All of you
Yes.
understand the ethics of the American Bar Association. All of you understand the question of what can be waived in attorney-client privilege, correct?
Yes.
I'll go right down. Ms. Wine-Banks, is it in fact your prerogative to waive attorney-client privilege? Do you have that right under the ethics rules?
I do not.
Correct.
Only my client does.
Exactly. Only your client can waive it. Mr. Hamilton, same, right?
Correct.
Mr. Trustee?
Same.
Mr. Costello?
Yes, which is why I have a written document of the waiver with me.
And so, although you have a waiver from your client, well, let's just say Mr. Cohen, did not have a waiver from President Trump. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Have any of you, either individually or seen other people, other attorneys, other than Mr. Cohen, tape their client and then turn it over for a prosecution or other use ever? Any of you?
Never.
No.
No.
Ms. Wine-Banks, it's kind of interesting that what hung President Nixon was, in fact, to a great extent, the tapes he made. But he made them, correct?
He made them, and they were evidence of crime, and so they fall within a crime fraud exception, and they proved the crime. They were the actual commission of crime.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Mr. Costello, I'm sorry. I'll take my reading glasses off. I'll do much better. We're dealing with an unusual situation. We have a president who was a former president who was never charged with any crimes until he announced and became the lead candidate to run for president. Is that correct?
Yes, quite a coincidence.
Yeah, I don't believe in coincidences happening that often.
Neither do I.
Neither do you. So the question I have for you here today is, have you ever seen uncoordinated a series of state and federal indictments of any candidate or any other person like this, where they're indicted in a state they never went to? They're indicted for documents that they had in their possession that they say they declassified and that they have a right to declassify. They get indicted for a misdemeanor that has already run its statute of limitations, but by linking it to a federal offense, which the state doesn't have the right to charge, they make the case and they're now trying that. Have you ever seen anything close to that in your decades of practice?
No, not at all.
So, Trustee, have you ever seen so many indictments that are novel in how they're put together?
I have not. I'd maybe use the word inventive, but either way, I'm with you on the point.
Mr. Hamilton, have you ever seen, and you're apparently the junior one here, have you ever seen or researched or learned about such a broad array of novel or inventive prosecutions as President Trump is dealing with?
Absolutely not.
Ms. Wine-Banks, I respect your years of practicing as an attorney. Have you ever seen so many charges coming, dating back so many years, but only coming to pass at this time?
I have.
When did you see them?
Well, let's go back to the fact that it takes a long time to investigate. that there was reason for example, in the New York.
No, I was asking for another example, and since you don't have one, let me just close. I've been up here for 24 years. I was a soldier when Nixon was president. I am appalled that what began with Watergate as a legitimate scandal of the wrongdoing has now become an organized weaponization by this president and his Department of Justice. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Goldman from New York for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you very much. Election interference, huh? That's what this is all about. Ms. Winebanks, there are 4 indictments against Donald Trump, is that right?
Correct.
And all 4 of those investigations started long before he announced his candidacy for president, isn't that right?
That is correct.
And in fact, he announced his candidacy for president 2 years before the election, just so he could bring in 3 witnesses and the entire Republican Party to say, election interference, election interference. These investigations long predated it. And this was a specific and obvious tactic of Donald Trump to be able to make a political defense that will never be allowed in a court of law, as Mr. Trusty and Mr. Costello know full well. And all because he wanted to co-opt this notion of election interference because he's a candidate. But let me tell you what is really election interference. Withholding military aid to an ally in the middle of a war in order to coerce and extort a foreign government to investigate a political opponent. Welcoming a foreign country to illegally interfere in our election and then using that interference for his own benefit, as Donald Trump did with Russia in 2016. Spend a year and a half on a completely bogus impeachment investigation into the president without finding a single piece of evidence of wrongdoing. And in fact, the chairman of this committee said the best evidence of President Biden's wrongdoing was a completely false accusation planted by Russia just before the 2020 election. Interesting timing. As usual, my Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle are accusing the Democrats of doing all of their misconduct that they engage in over and over and over in an effort to normalize it, in an effort to deflect attention from their own wrongdoing. It is right in authoritarian 101 playbook. But let's talk about this 2-tiered system of justice. Let's talk about lawfare. Mr. Costello, your entire opening statement, as I heard it, was simply to discredit Michael Cohen. Sir, I think you're in the wrong place. Michael Cohen is currently on the witness stand at a trial in Manhattan. And if you have information about Michael Cohen's testimony, you should talk to Donald Trump and his lawyers to see if they want to call you as a witness to impeach Michael Cohen. But you know that coming down here, outside of that courtroom, while that witness is on the stand to try to impeach his credibility and his testimony, is jury tampering. You know it is unethical. You know that you are trying to discredit a current witness at a current trial who is testifying right now outside of that courtroom. You know better, and it is shameful. Mr. Trusty, you and I worked together at the Department of Justice. We had a number of interactions related to organized crime. I had no idea what your politics were. I imagine you had no idea what my politics were, because it doesn't matter. And it's very interesting to hear you now nitpick about the Speedy Trial Act and about what you claim to be unprecedented conduct in Mar-a-Lago. But I'm confident that you never came across anyone who refused a request to voluntarily return classified materials, who refused to comply with a subpoena for those classified materials, who was found to intentionally conceal and hide and obstruct justice by concealing those classified documents. You've never come across, that is unprecedented, I am certain, because that is a clear predicate for a search warrant. When someone obstructs justice, refuses to comply with the subpoena, and Mr. Issa can make up all of the facts that he wants about declaring it to be classified because he thought it or whatever it is, that will be decided in court. All of these cases will be decided in court by a jury based on the facts, evidence, and the law. And all the Republican majority is trying to do here today is lawfare, is interfere in ongoing criminal investigations that our system is perfectly well equipped to handle. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Stefanik for 5 minutes.
Oh, I love being able to respond to the novice from New York. First of all, thank you so much for stating the obvious that political lawfare is in fact election interference. That's what we're seeing with the sham Alvin Bragg trial. Thank you also to the novice freshman member for New York, highlighting that withholding military aid to an ally for a political purpose, just like Joe Biden is doing to Israel. Always grateful for you stepping in it. Mr. Costello, in your opening statement, you said that in the over 50 years serving as a lawyer, you, quote, have never seen the types of politically motivated cases that have been brought in this presidential election season. These political cases are being used as a weapon of war to damage, defeat, or impede political adversaries and their allies. Instead of political warfare, it is lawfare, a cancer upon our collective judicial system. I want to begin with Alvin Bragg's weaponized sham trial in New York. Isn't it true that in Alvin Bragg's campaign for Manhattan DA, Bragg specifically ran on going after President Donald Trump?
That is true.
Isn't it true that Bragg's predecessor, Cy Vance, declined to prosecute President Trump?
That is true.
And the FEC also did not prosecute President Trump.
That is true.
And the DOJ did not prosecute President Trump in this case.
The DOJ referring to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District?
Correct.
Absolutely true.
And one of the reasons the Southern District of New York turned down this case was because the supposed star witness, according to Alvin Bragg, Michael Cohen, was totally, quote, unworthy of belief. Isn't that true?
Without a doubt.
This is the same Michael Cohen who pled guilty to 7 counts in an indictment that had absolutely nothing to do with President Trump and actually predated the first time he met President Trump, correct?
Absolutely true.
And in fact, this is the same Michael Cohen who perjured himself to Congress. Isn't that true?
Yes.
In fact, when called as a witness in this sham trial, Cohen was asked directly if he was honest during his testimony to Congress. He said no, admitting perjury. But it's not just Bragg's case that is a total sham and illegal political lawfare going after Joe Biden's top political opponent, Donald Trump. This rot goes deep all the way up to the top in the Oval Office. Because when Congress referred this admission of Cohen's perjury to Joe Biden's DOJ, isn't it true that the DOJ has refused to prosecute?
That is true.
Isn't it correct that Michael Colangelo, who was the 3rd highest ranking official in Biden's DOJ, was transferred to Bragg's office to run this weaponized prosecution of President Trump? Isn't that true?
Not only true, but it's unheard of.
Unheard of. It's a disgrace. Do you agree that this weaponization of lawfare goes straight to the top with the purpose of helping Joe Biden's failing presidential campaign?
The circumstantial evidence definitely supports that.
And the unconstitutional gag order on President Trump from New York Judge Merchant is unprecedented lawfare.
As far as I know, absolutely.
And let's go to the daughter of the judge. Isn't it true that she is raising millions of dollars off of this sham case?
Well, I have to say I've read that in the media. I don't know it of my own knowledge.
It is true.
Thank you.
One additional question. I want to talk about the rigged and unprecedented jury selection process. Isn't it true that Bragg's team asked the jurors if they followed Trump on social media?
Yes.
And isn't it true that they did not ask any of the potential jurors if they followed Biden on social media?
Or Michael Cohen.
Or Michael
Yes.
Cohen.
Yeah.
And isn't it true that 87% of the jurors said they voted for Joe Biden?
That's true.
Is this unprecedented and lawfare jury shopping?
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. Political lawfare for the purpose of election interference to go after Donald Trump. Do you agree?
Totally.
This is one of the reasons that Trump's polls continue to skyrocket. And it's why President Trump will win in 2024 to end the illegal and warped weaponization of the justice system, because if they can illegally go after Trump, they can go after anyone. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Jordan started this hearing by saying, quote, "You can't make this stuff up." But anyone who has followed this committee's hearings since the beginning knows that that's exactly what the Republican members are doing in this committee. We've been making this stuff up day after day and pushing out untruths from Jewish space lasers to the big lie. The big lie. Let's start with that one. The claim that Biden lost the election and Trump really won, in spite of the fact that Rudolph Giuliani and his crew brought 60 cases in 5 different states, lost every single case, even before Trump appointed judges, lost every single case that they brought for lack of evidence. Some of these cases didn't even survive a motion to dismiss. There was just no evidence. And yet, my colleagues on the other side, including the chairman, Mr. Jordan, continue to push that big lie that Trump really won the election. And let's talk about Hunter Biden's laptop. We don't talk about that anymore. That was the smoking gun. That was the thing that was going to prove all these theories about wrongful conduct on the part of the president. And then there was Alexander Smirnov, who Chairman Jordan said he represents the most corroborating evidence that we have. The most corroborating evidence we have until he was arrested. He was indicted, then arrested. He's still in custody. Your star witness. Your star witness. This is baloney. And, you know, Hannah Arendt, who was a historian who was in Germany at the time of Hitler's rise, she wrote a book about the origins of totalitarianism. And she talked about the active, aggressive capability to believe in lies. Not just gullibility, but the active, aggressive capability to believe in lies. You know, just as in Germany, the time and the truth catch up to all those lies. And, you know, there's some good people on the other side of the aisle. And I just worry about your reputations and your family's reputations about pushing this crap. You know, we can disagree about things, but when you're pushing stuff like that is harmful to our democracy, and you're of all people, following Donald Trump, dear God Almighty, that's where you're gonna die on that hill. You're gonna die on that hill. Sometimes when someone accuses you of something that you're not doing, they're the ones who are actually doing it. And we're here today to talk about the so-called weaponization of the federal government. So I have here a compilation of letters and interventions that Chairman Jordan has authored and submitted to the 4 cases that are ongoing right now. 3 of them are federal, 1 of them is a state criminal trial. These are all criminal trials in which Donald Trump is a defendant. And so these all represent either threatened subpoenas or attacks on or other types of legal, I guess you'd call it lawfare, attacks on the courts, the prosecutors, and in some cases, witnesses. So even up to last week, Mr. Jordan was calling for the investigation of Michael Cohen before he's a witness about to take the stand, and Chairman Jordan went so far to send a letter to the Department of Justice demanding that it investigate former Trump attorney Michael Cohen for perjury. That was last week, before he took the stand. Talk about interference with the legal process and lawfare. That's what's going on this committee. And to be honest with you, I agree with Maria Bartiromo, her frustration. We got better things to do than this circus. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
From the testimony of Michael Cohen's lawyer, Mr. Costello. These days, you see individuals running for prospective office who claim, if you elect me, I will bring down this public figure or that public figure who disagrees with my political philosophy. Understand that to destroy a political rival, you need not convict that person of a crime. All you must do is leak the fact that the individual is being investigated for a particular crime, thereby destroying his or her reputation and causing that individual to incur legal fees to defend themselves. The net result is, if you can destroy their reputation and bankrupt them with legal fees, you have effectively eliminated or canceled your opposition without ever convicting them of a crime or getting a civil judgment against them. Mr. Costello, I just wanted to say I felt very seen by your testimony that was provided to the committee. But I want to get back to what Mr. Lynch said previously, that sometimes when you're accused of something, it's actually the people accusing you who are doing that thing. Now, you were accused of illegally dangling a pardon before Michael Cohen, right?
Correct.
And that was a lie.
Absolutely.
That accusation could not withstand any scrutiny or review from the Southern District of New York, where Mr. Goldman worked, where other great attorneys have worked, right?
And where I worked.
Right, but that dangling,
Correct.
that accusation of dangling something improper. Remember what Mr. Lynch said. If you're being accused of that, maybe it's the people doing the accusing. Now, Mr. Trusty, you described a searing fact pattern moments ago. You accused a Department of Justice official of an extortionist ploy to dangle a judgeship before a lawyer to get that lawyer to betray their client, Walt Nada, right?
Yes, I have no reason to disbelieve that lawyer.
And who was the Department of Justice official that engaged in that extortionist ploy?
Well, the lead person in that conversation was Jay Bratt, who's still currently assigned to the Southern District of Florida case.
What is that? I mean, for those of you who've been prosecutors, who've dedicated your lives to the rule of law, what does it tell us about the shape of the legal system that you have people with the ability to do what Mr. Costello laid out in testimony, to charge you with a crime, destroy your reputation, bankrupt you, like they're trying to do to Walt Nada, a patriot who served in our military, and then to hear this claim that they were literally trying to compromise the lawyer? How should we reflect on a legal system that permits that?
It's broken. I had a friend of mine from the Department of Justice text me not too long ago, and he said, it's going to take decades for the department to fix itself. And I love that place. I worked there. I was a prosecutor for 27 years, but I am fearful that we've crossed the Rubicon by being ends justified the means, by engaging in selective targeting and differential treatment. And I don't know how it ends or how it gets better, but I'm happy to at least bring evidence about that issue.
Well, and that's why these hearings are so necessary. I think that we would love to stay well constrained within our Article 1 lane. But when we've got this Article 2 process that is unloading on political rivals in Article 3 courts, as Mr. Costello said, the only way to have a check and a balance on that system is for the Congress to step forward and to utilize its tools, the most profound being the power of the purse, but indeed we have powers of impeachment and oversight that are important as well. Mr. Costello, is Michael Cohen a liar?
That doesn't begin to describe him. He lies at every opportunity when it's in his favor. And I mean, I could, if you had a half an hour or 45 minutes, I could start to list the many lies that he told us.
Well, let's just triage them. Is there a single branch of government that Michael Cohen hasn't lied to?
Gee, I think there isn't.
Right. I mean, you really have to work hard to hit the hat trick. I mean, it's one thing to lie to investigators. And I guess it's another thing to lie to Congress, but to lie to investigators and then Congress and then courts.
Don't forget the judges.
Yeah, the
He
judges.
lied to the judge, too, when he pled guilty.
And it's just so odd. I mean, it's not every day you see someone's former lawyer having to come forward and say, I regrettably have to inform the Congress, the court, whomever, that my own client, I am aware, is a liar.
Thank goodness he was foolish enough to execute the waiver of the attorney-client privilege, because he was trying to implicate Rudy Giuliani and myself in a crime, which was absurd.
He even lied about that. He even lied about trying to turn on you, and I guess his lies are defied by his other lies and the writings and the paperwork, and this liar should not be able to hold our elections hostage, and that is why this hearing is so critical. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts for a point of order? Or unanimous consent, I assume?
Mr. Chairman, I asked unanimous consent to submit a compilation of your statements and letters to the 4 trials in which Donald Trump is currently the defendant.
Objection. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, you should recuse yourself. These are all your letters.
Was that part of the unanimous consent request? I didn't hear that if it was. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, my Republican colleagues claimed a 2-tiered system of justice exists because Trump was indicted for his handling of classified documents and exposing our nation's most guarded secrets, while Republican Special Counsel Robert Hur found President Biden innocent of any wrongdoing. Let's walk through the facts. On May 11, 2022, a year after the archives began repeatedly demanding that Trump turn over presidential records and warned him that they may have to refer the matter to DOJ if he did not cooperate, a grand jury issued a subpoena for Trump to produce the classified documents in his possession. Trump's response to his lawyers was, and I quote, "I don't want anybody looking. I don't want anybody looking through my boxes. I really don't. I don't want you looking through my boxes." Trump even questioned, what happens if we don't respond at all or don't play ball with them? And then Trump added, wouldn't it be better if we just told them we don't have anything here? And, well, look, isn't it better if there are no documents? Does this sound like someone who follows and respects the law? I certainly don't think so. Ms. Weinbanks, President Biden didn't refuse to cooperate with investigators for a year, correct? Did President Biden lie about classified documents at his residence, or did his lawyers proactively inform the archives of this fact?
You've stated it correctly.
Unlike Donald Trump, Joe Biden didn't prevent anyone from going through any boxes or materials to search for classified documents, correct?
He welcomed them to his house and his offices.
Thank you. Now let's contrast how Donald Trump acted compared to President Biden. On June 2nd, 2022, even after Trump's lawyer arranged a time to go through each box in a specific storage room, Trump instructed his valet and co-defendant, Walter Nauta, to move 64 boxes filled with classified documents from the storage room to Trump's residence, where Trump knew his attorney would not be searching. After Nauta moved these boxes from the storage room to Trump's residence, Trump's lawyers, unaware that the boxes had been moved, found no classified materials and certified this to the FBI. The FBI relied on the lawyer's certification. Seemingly, for the moment, Trump duped his own lawyers. All that activity took place in my home state of Florida, yet my Sunshine State law and order colleagues on the other side of the aisle uttered not a complaint about Trump's obvious cover-up of criminality and wrongdoing. I know that's shocking to everyone here. Talk about 2 tiers of justice. Now, so we're clear about this, please share with me, Ms. Weinbanks, did President Biden ever move materials to hide them from his lawyers according to Hur investigation?
No.
Did he ever instruct anyone else to do so for him?
No.
Did he ever attempt to hide documents from investigators at all?
No.
Okay, continuing on. In another act of deception, Donald Trump also, quote, attempted to delete security camera footage at the Mar-a-Lago Club to conceal information from the FBI and grand jury, unquote. This was after the subpoena had been issued, which specifically called for security camera footage around the site where the boxes were stored. President Biden didn't delete security camera footage around the sites where classified documents had been stored in his home, Ms. Weinbanks, correct?
Yes.
And President Biden never attempted to delete or dispose of any evidence that he knew investigators asked for, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. This isn't a 2-tiered system of justice. These are just two men who acted very differently, one compliant, one criminally obstructive. One is an upstanding American civil servant who fully cooperated with an investigation, and the other is a man who took multiple criminal actions to cover up his intentional theft of sensitive public and national security documents. Ms. Weinbanks, prosecuting a president or former president comes with many challenges, as you well know as a member of the team that prosecuted President Nixon. In your experience, what would be the impact on our judicial and democratic systems if presidents could never be held accountable?
I think the consequences and the danger of that is enormous. I have long believed that a former president takes the role of any ordinary citizen and can be held accountable. I also believe that the Office of Legal Counsel opinion is incorrect and that even a sitting president could be held accountable, that there is no possible way that even within the outer parameters of a president's responsibilities is the commission of crimes, and that when the evidence of crimes is there, they must be pursued in order to protect our democracy.
Thank you, Ms. Winebanks. And I think it's important to point out that the most clear evidence of why we're here on a Wednesday for the first time, by the way, which, not uncoincidentally happens to be the day that the court is not in session and make it more likely that the defendant is watching, that the purpose of this hearing is to witness tamper. The purpose of this hearing is to try to influence the jury to do things that Donald Trump has a gag order to prevent him from doing, all with his lackeys here on the other side of the aisle, aiding and abetting that goal. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Trustee, did Joe Biden keep classified documents?
Yes, he did.
Did he knowingly disclose classified information?
It appears that he did to a biographer for about an $8 million advance fee.
And what was his motive for doing so?
About an $8 million advance
An
fee.
$8 million motive to knowingly keep and knowingly disclose classified information.
Correct.
But he's getting nothing because he's a forgetful elderly gentleman and he's not going to be charged. And yet they're going to have to President Trump. Let me ask you this. I want to go back to where Mr. Gates was. Who's Stanley Woodward?
Stanley Woodward is a defense attorney in Washington, D.C. with a stellar reputation for honesty, very intelligent guy, and someone I met during the process of representing President Trump.
But in the context Mr. Gates was just at, he's the one who had the judgeship dangled in front of him, right?
Exactly. He had a Superior Court judgeship pending at the time, so that wasn't out of thin air. And he reported it promptly and eventually swore an affidavit to a federal judge.
And here's what the Department of Justice said to him, quote, "Your guy Walt needs to flip. I'd hate to see you jeopardize your chances for the judgeship." Doesn't get much plainer than that, does it?
Does not.
Is that lawfare at its worst?
Among other words, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've never seen anything like this. And you've worked with Mr. Woodward, and he's not necessarily on the Republican side of the aisle, is he?
My best guess is he is not.
He's not. But he's a good, honest lawyer, the way the Justice Department is supposed to operate.
He is, and I think typical for him being the person he is of integrity, he doesn't like being in this position. He's probably not thrilled that I'm even talking about it, but the truth is the truth.
The truth is the truth. How about this, Mr. Costello? I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything on Donald Trump. Who said that?
Michael Cohen about 10 to 20 times.
So not just once, multiple times he told you that while you were his attorney, while you were in consultation with your client, he said that multiple times.
He not only said that multiple times, but he said that after I said to him, knowing that he was suicidal, "Michael, think about this. Isn't it easier to cooperate against Donald Trump than it is to kill yourself?" And he still said, "I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything."
When you laid it all out, you said, dude, you better cooperate. If you got something truthful on the president, you better let me have it or you're in trouble. And he came back with the exact same statement. I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything on Trump.
That is correct. And that was my obligation to do that, to fully inform him of what his escape route was, as he called it.
And then he changed his story, right? Then he went on
It
TV
suited
and
him.
changed his
Exactly.
story.
He changed his story. He turned around, and he's the only one who can do that. You have to believe Michael Cohen in order to convict Donald Trump if there's actually a crime there, which there isn't. But that's an issue for an appellate court.
I want to read another statement, another line from your statement. You said, Alvin Bragg refused my offer. What was the offer?
My offer was to come to his office and sit down, let him look me in the eye, and see if I'm telling the truth. When I had all these documents that showed that Michael Cohen simply was not a reliable witness, that his predecessors in the Southern District of New York decided after they spoke to me with the FBI that Michael Cohen wasn't reliable, and they never used him again for anything.
Why wouldn't Alvin Bragg talk to you? Why do you think?
You'd have to ask him that. But I talked to 8 of his assistant DAs.
What was that reception like?
I gave them a Zoom conference interview for an hour and a half before I testified in the grand jury on Monday. And then on Monday, when I testified in the grand jury, they did everything in their power not to ask me the questions that would elicit the exculpatory information.
And is this the same information you took to the Southern District of New York?
It is.
Same information. They were happy to get it.
Exactly.
What did they decide? What did the
Well, they
Southern District-
decided they did not use Michael Cohen for anything again,
Yeah.
and they didn't proceed against Donald Trump for anything.
They saw what anyone with common sense would see. We can't make this guy as our star witness in a prosecution. We can't do that. And they didn't do it. And they didn't bring any charges, right?
That's correct.
And even Alvin Bragg understood that. Alvin Bragg said, quote, he could not see a world in which he would indict Trump and call Mr. Cohen as a prosecution witness, but then he changed his mind. And he didn't change his mind until after President Trump was an announced candidate for president, which I think underscores this fundamental point. This is all about politics. And that's your experience dealing with Mr. Bragg and his team. Is that right, Mr. Costello?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no coincidences here. The fact that Judge Merchan has had all of these cases, and by the way, when he finishes with the Donald Trump case, Steve Bannon is next. Out of all the judges in New York County, somehow they keep on coming up with the same judge. Coincidence?
I don't think so.
I don't believe in them.
I think it's all coordinated. Let me just, in my last 8 seconds, Mr. Trustee, let me just ask you this. When the prosecution alters the sequence and the order of the documents they seized in a raid that broke all precedent in what they did, the physical documents don't match up with the scanned documents. Is that a problem?
It is. I mean, we viewed the materials almost like carbon dating. You could see dates of newspaper articles, you'd see photographs, you'd see an item marked classified. The exact context is an important part of the proof for the government as well as the defense, for the defense attorney. So altering that and not being able to retreat back to some sort of recreation is a serious problem.
And you see the irony, don't you? The irony of Jack Smith mishandling documents all the while he's charging President Trump with mishandling documents. I mean, I don't think that's lost on anyone.
Well, and remember, it came out in the context of correcting a prior statement to the court that there was not a problem with mishandling the documents.
Oh, so they even worse or even better, I guess, is even.
Let's go with worse.
It'd be funnier if it wasn't so true. My time has expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you. Gosh, Ms. Banks, I'm listening to this, and I guess I'm supposed to be persuaded that the only liar in the platform is Mr. Cohen. Now, help me reflect a little bit, because I want to make sure my memory serves me well. Did the former President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, was he found guilty of lying and massive fraud by the state of New York?
Yes,
So he lied,
he did.
and he was found guilty of it.
Yes.
So we can speculate about others, but in this case, we have a record. Was he fined by that? He had probably given a little slap in the wrist, right?
They gave him a huge slap in the wrist, and in one of those cases, the judge said that Michael Cohen was credible. So we have that affirmation of his credibility, and the prosecution doesn't pick the witnesses, the defendant does. Witnesses who are cooperating were former co-conspirators, and they do acts in furtherance of the conspiracy and in aid of their co-conspirator, in this case, Mr. Trump.
Well, my. So we can have this theater about a particular witness and his credibility, but we actually have a rendering, a judgment rendered in the court in New York in a case brought by the Attorney General of New York. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right. And apparently they were all engaged in a conspiracy against this poor innocent former president of the United States. Was that same individual, the former president of the United States, also found guilty in a different court of defamation, and defamation being you lied about somebody?
Yes.
He was found guilty.
He was found guilty of that and of sexual assault.
And of sexual assault. Oh. Well, was he fined for that?
Very large fine.
Another large fine. So he lied about his business and was convicted of committing civil fraud in the state of New York and fined almost, well, with interest and everything, close to $500 million?
Correct.
And had to actually post a bond to make good as a surety on that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, the title of this subcommittee, select subcommittee, is weaponization, the false premise being that the federal government is all organized to weaponize against innocent, especially right-wing victims. Now, if I told you, given your background, that someone running for president of the United States has said, I'll be a dictator on day one.
One day.
Out of his own mouth. And we know that there are plans to create huge detention camps that could hold and process millions, not thousands, of immigrants in the United States. And they have a plan to politicize the 2.2 million federal employee workforce by creating a new schedule, Schedule F, and initially start with 50,000 political employees appointed rather than civil service career professionals. Would I be fair to say that sounds like weaponization to me?
It does. Project 2025 is very scary to me, and it includes a weaponization attempt through the Department of Justice. It says in plain language that's what they intend to do if Donald Trump is reelected.
And, well, if I were to read, I could read a series of quotes to you, but I'll give it. If I happen to be president and see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say go down and indict them. They would be out of business. They'd be out of the election. You know who said that?
No.
Donald Trump. On day one of my new administration, I will direct the Department of Justice. This Department of Justice, Mr. Trustee and Mr. Costello want to preserve. On day one of my administration, I'll direct the Department of Justice to investigate every radical district attorney and attorney general for their illegal, racist enforcement of the law. You know who said that?
I'm going to guess it was Donald Trump.
And does that sound to you like the weaponization of the Department of Justice to go after political enemies or perceived opponents?
It does.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Trustee, is it true, or do you believe, I'm going to ask you to speculate on something, that some of these cases are going to get overturned even if they do get a prosecution in their current venue?
Yeah, I do think that when prosecutors are being inventive for historically important prosecutions, that they can collapse of their own weight. And maybe that is for misconduct in Georgia, maybe that's for a novel felonization of misdemeanors in New York. But I do think that it puts a lot of pressure on the appellate courts, but they may well get to that point where trial judges go along with the game, but the appellate court does not.
So isn't it a characteristic of lawfare sometimes that you don't really care how the case is going to end up, that the process is the punishment?
Sure. I mean, look, for any client, it is strain and stressful to go through an accusation and a trial. It's got to be particularly maddening when you're running for president to be going through that, to be tied up in New York courtrooms for most of the day. So, yeah, it is. There's a win without a win for the proponents of lawfare sometimes.
Mr. Hamilton, I want to talk about the special counsel office in general. The Appointments Clause of the Constitution says the president shall nominate and with the advice and consent of Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. Are U.S. attorneys nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate according to the Appointments Clause?
In fact, they are.
U.S. attorneys are held to the Appointments Clause because they are delegated some part of the sovereign power of the United States, such as the ability to make indictments and charge individuals with crimes. Was Jack Smith nominated by President Biden or confirmed by the Senate?
He was not.
He was merely given the powers of the special counsel by Attorney General Garland, wasn't he?
That's correct.
I think it's kind of a fallacy that Congress can create this special office and that it will be free of any political bias. Do you believe that Special Counsel Jack Smith is acting independently of the White House?
Absolutely not.
And what leads you to believe that he's not?
So it's not only the novel application of some of these statutes to former President Trump, twisting statutes that this Congress wrote, twisting the meaning of plain language, of sections like 1512C. interpreting the Presidential Records Act in a way that precludes Donald Trump from deciding which records are his. There's all kinds of different things that he's doing. But I would say that the manner in which they've been acting, as my colleagues on this panel have testified to, the manner in which they have conducted themselves in their investigation, every step along the way, whether it's cataloging evidence or whether it's statements to the court and everything in between, Jack Smith is acting like a partisan hack. And he has a record of that doing so in the past.
And, you know, according to reporting, Jay Bratt, a top aide to Special Counsel Jack Smith, met with White House officials multiple times, including just weeks before Special Counsel Smith indicted President Trump. I mean, it's hard to say that he's independent if these meetings are in fact going on, isn't it?
That's correct.
I think maybe we need a hearing later on to talk about this office itself and how it's been weaponized. I'm going to yield my remaining time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Trustee, you've talked about earlier Jack Smith's obsession with getting this trial done before, in a speedy fashion, I think before the election, I mean, it seems to me that in and of itself, all of them are concerned these trials may not happen before the, why does that matter? We want justice done right. That should be the focus, not some artificial timeline.
I think the speedy trial demand betrayed the political underpinning of the entire process. There's no reason for a federal prosecutor with a non-incarcerated defendant to say anything. And if I could just for a quick sec, the model here, there was a real obvious model that would have given us all more faith in this process. That is full transparency on behalf of the Department of Justice. Coming into court and saying, we're turning over everything in discovery, we're ready for trial, but Judge, you tell us we'll show up when we need to show up. We're here for small j justice, not capital J justice, as we used to say at DOJ. That's the problem. That model of transparency and openness, not fighting special master supervision, not appealing everything, not trashing Judge Cannon in Florida, that's what we could have had some respect for and some belief that the process is playing out fairly.
You only bring charges after he announces for president, then of course you want the trials before the election. That seems so obvious, I think, to anyone with common sense. That's what they're trying to do. Now, the good news is it's all falling apart. It's all falling apart, which when you have these kind of cases, maybe that's what we should have probably expected in the end. I think the gentleman for yielding. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, good morning. I apologize. I have a competing hearing that I had to sort of play dual role here this morning. While I miss your opening statements, I certainly have looked at what you were prepared to testify to. And frankly, you know, I have some questions, but I'm just sort of still astounded to hear that some of my colleagues are questioning the timing of the charges and all of this poor little Donald Trump got indicted story. I'm astounded by their claim that there's a two-tier system of justice, all because the twice impeached former president was indicted on charges for mishandling of classified documents and Biden was not. You know, that's the bottom line. Biden and Pence were not. It's ridiculous. And I don't say that as a Democrat or as a member of Congress. I say that as a former judge responsible for upholding our Constitution and the rule of law. Apparently, my Republican colleagues need a refresher on criminal law. To convict someone of a crime, a prosecutor must prove each element of that criminal act beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecuting someone under the relevant statutes in these cases, a prosecutor would have to prove willfulness. Defendants would have to have willingly withheld these documents. Mr. Hur's report cleared President Biden of wrongdoing. But boy, oh boy, did Trump willfully steal and conceal, new mode of operation there, steal and conceal his documents. In his words, when he realized he had the documents in his possession, he didn't call authorities to come get them like President Biden or Vice President Pence did to correct the problem. No, he thwarted every attempt to have federal prosecutors from coming in. Reports say he said, quote, what happens if we just don't play, end quote, with investigators, and that he didn't want anyone getting, quote, his documents. His documents. He has some strange belief that classified documents are his and his only. So he lied to his lawyers and he lied to the FBI, pretending he didn't have any more documents, when in fact he instructed his aide to hide those documents around his unsecured property in Florida. We've all seen the pictures. He threw them in bathrooms and bedrooms in a building that had tens of thousands of people come through, where 150 members of his staff worked. This isn't a tiered system of justice. It's just the criminal justice system evaluating the facts. Facts Republicans apparently seem uninterested in and want to totally ignore. Because facts aren't what matter to my colleagues across the aisle, as they have proven today. But regardless of how much they try, in America, no one is above the law, not even a former twice impeached president. Ms. Winebanks, you were a prosecutor that worked on the Watergate case. As a former prosecutor, can you speak to what is needed to prove willingness, and do you think that it can be proven in this case with the classified documents?
Absolutely, and I think some of the conduct, which all occurred after he was out of office, including the concealing of the documents, including telling people to delete the video, including everything that he did to make sure that things weren't found. He hid documents from his own lawyer by moving them from where he knew his lawyer would be searching. He caused his lawyer to file a false statement to the FBI about, here's the documents we have. Those are all evidence of his knowledge and his willfulness. He knew he had those documents. He knew he didn't want them to be turned over. And if I could just add, the Presidential Records Act is something that was passed as a result of Richard Nixon's conduct. And so I'm very familiar with it. And it extends to not just classified documents, but to all the records of a president. So he was holding many, many documents that should have been turned over as a routine matter when he left the White House.
And this is opposed to how Vice President Biden and former Vice President Pence handled their requests.
That is correct. And in the case of Biden, the special counsel investigating concluded that there was no evidence of willfulness that could establish beyond a reasonable doubt that he had any knowledge or willfulness in possessing those documents. And there were even specific findings about things like his diaries, which have long been held since Ronald Reagan was president, to be the personal possession. Those are personal documents. The president, former President Trump, tried to say everything is my personal documents. That's not how it works. Personal documents are like the diaries and handwritten notes.
Well, thank you, and I'm running out of time, but would you say that they're really, I mean, I don't even know what this, what are they calling it, legal affair? Or,
Lawfare.
I mean, does that word even make sense?
Well, I had to look it up. It's not one that I had ever heard except in terms of the Lawfare blog. And so I looked it up, and I was quite surprised at what its meaning was in terms of weaponization. And I think, as I was being asked earlier, the Project 2025 is the weaponization of government.
Well, and this is, they're talking about this from someone who's found countless and countless and countless of lawsuits against contractors, against property owners. I mean, he's Mr. Lawsuit himself. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Costello, I'm over here on this end, sir.
Oh, thank you.
I want to distinguish something. It's extremely bad judgment to put an inveterate, well-known liar on the stand. It's bad judgment for a lawyer to do that because that person's subject to impeachment for his lies. That's true, right?
That is true.
Okay. And impeachment, for those watching, that's when you destroy the credibility of a testifying witness, right?
You do. You also destroy the credibility of the office,
Absolutely.
which is why I wanted to sit down with Alvin Bragg.
But there's another problem with doing that, isn't there? That is to say that the witness might give false testimony while on the stand. And that's something yet further is, how many lies did you testify Cohen testified to yesterday in New York court?
Well, I only read the section that involved me, and virtually every statement that he made about our interaction was false.
Okay. Alvin Bragg and his assistants prosecuting that case, they're lawyers, right?
They are, yes.
Can lawyers knowingly permit their own witness to testify falsely before a court?
Absolutely not.
Is that just a matter of bad judgment or something more?
No, it's a matter of ethics. It's
Okay.
required.
Are lawyers who do that susceptible to punishment for it?
They are susceptible.
If lawyers do that and they're doing so in the course of interfering with an ongoing presidential election, could they be subject to punishment for that?
I would think so, sure.
I noticed that today, in the course of this proceeding so far, not one Democrat has asked either of you a question and allowed you to speak to it.
I not only noticed that, but I noticed that after they take cheap shots, they leave.
Absolutely. Speaking of that cheap shot, Mr. Goldman, he's a great lawyer, by the way, so he knows not to ask you a question.
Well, we've had prior dealings, and I think he does know not to ask me a question.
I'm sure. But do you care to respond to what he suggested?
Well, he's suggesting that this is jury interference. First of all, I had nothing to do with the scheduling of this hearing. And second of all, nobody knew when Michael Cohen was going to testify. The prediction by the media and also by the prosecutors was that this was going to be a 5 or a 6 week trial. So according to that, Michael Cohen shouldn't be testifying for another week or two. So to claim that we're just doing this to interfere with the jury that's been instructed, of course, not to watch proceedings such as this, is ridiculous.
Right.
It's a cheap shot, and that's why I called it that.
Totally agree. And I'll just observe. When I was reading your statement, I noticed that you said you had been practicing law for 51 years. I said, wow, you're going to be old.
No.
What a great head of hair and great, absolutely have it all together. So, but you've been practicing law at a high level for 51 years. Mr. Trusty, next year, I think you said you were with the Justice Department for 27 years. Is that correct?
I was a prosecutor for 17 at DOJ.
Okay, prosecutor 27 years and 17 at DOJ.
So yes, I'm not as old as Bob.
No.
Thank you for that.
No one has attempted to lay a glove on either of you. How about Stanley Woodward? Has anybody, to your knowledge, challenged his sworn account of being extorted by Jay Bratt, Mr. Trusty?
No, but I also have no evidence of the department looking inward about it at all.
What indeed is the recourse if this shouldn't come before this committee, as the members of the minority have said? What indeed is the recourse for this? Mr. Trusty?
I'm not sure. Certainly disqualification from the case, which would be a starting point here. And there should be a robust OPR investigation on the DOJ side. My experience with OPR, even in some of the worst accusations that were made to people in the department, was that they geared it to not make decisions until after the litigation was closed, which was very self-serving. I'm a little concerned that the public ramifications by way of OPR and DOJ's response might be years away.
That seems to be the problem. No one's ever held to account, and the process takes years and years and years and then ends in a whimper with somebody sending a report forth, and the problems just keep coming. I encourage those who are watching, unfortunately, I've only got about 30 seconds left, to read the last two. Actually, both of your statements are extraordinary. Anybody watching this hearing ought to pull those statements up and read them, word for word. They're magnificent, well drafted. And the end of yours, Mr. Trusty, in which you characterize where the Justice Department is and how much of a problem this is and how dangerous it is to the country, I think are maybe two of the most significant paragraphs I've read while I've been in Congress. And I encourage people to look at them.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. But I tell you, I appreciate your coming here. It is that on both cases, it is an act of service to the country. And I think the American people are wise to this. And I know how it's going to go. The only question is what comes next. How is this going to be dealt with in the next administration? Because be dealt with, it must be. You bet.
Gentleman yields back. Well said, particularly the reference to the gentleman's written testimony. I would encourage everyone to read that. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I might start, since the issue of veracity has come up repeatedly here, if I might enter into the record 3 articles that have recently appeared dealing with the veracity of the former president. One's from Time Magazine, another one from, let's see here, yes. Mr. Chairman, may I enter these into the records?
Well, I thought you were going to read. You said Time Magazine. You said the 2 others. But yeah, without objection.
Thank you. I was just trying to define lawfare, and apparently it has to do with using the federal government, in this case, to weaponize or to carry out some action against somebody. Now, if someone were to say, I will appoint a special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of the United States of America, would that be lawfare?
I believe it would.
Thank you. If someone were to say, if I happen to be president and I see somebody who's doing well and beating me very badly, I say, go down and indict them. They would be out of business. They would be out of the election. Is that lawfare?
That is definitely a violation of everything that the Department of Justice stands for. It is lawfare. You need to have some evidence to begin an investigation, and the president himself has no role in directing who the Department of Justice will investigate or prosecute.
If I might continue, thank you. On day one of my new administration, I will direct the Department of Justice to investigate every radical DA, Attorney General, for the illegal, racist enforcement of the law. Is that lawfare?
Yes.
Do you know who made those statements? Let me tell you.
Okay.
Those are direct quotes from the new wannabe president, former President Trump. Apparently, he wants to use his power as president to weaponize the Department of Justice and every other federal agency to go after his enemies, political or otherwise. One of these quotes might be his business interest. Would that be inappropriate for a president or a wannabe president to make these statements, and even more so to do that should that person become president?
It would be.
Do any of you gentlemen disagree that that would be inappropriate for a president to do any of those three things? Gentlemen? Yes or no? It's appropriate or inappropriate?
I don't accept the premises fully, so I'm having a hard time with yes or no.
Don't give me that lawyery business. The question is, those are statements made by the former president of the United States as he prepares to become the next president. Are those appropriate actions by any president? Yes or no?
Yeah. I don't have an answer for you, sir.
I thought you might not. Mr. Costello, are those appropriate things for any president to do? Yes or no?
I don't think that's a yes or no question.
Thank you. I knew you would not answer the question. But I'll ask it one more time. These statements, are they appropriate action by any president? Yes or no?
I would say they're not appropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Hamilton, do you want to opine on this?
Well, like my colleague, Mr. Trustee, I reject the premise of the question of out-of-context statements, but I would say...
We're going to move on. Thank you very much. That's not all that's been said. If we were to go through the various statements, on day one, I will be a dictator. Is that an appropriate thing for an American president to be, or even to say he would be? Anybody want to answer that question?
It is inappropriate.
Mr. Hamilton, appropriate or inappropriate for a wannabe
You didn't want to hear me a
president?
second ago, so why are you asking me now?
I'll answer it's humorous. I don't think the guy actually thinks he's about to be a dictator.
Exactly.
So you think it's inappropriate to say that?
No, it's humorous. I like humor.
Do you like dictators?
It's not an issue. He served for 4 years as president. I don't remember a dictatorship breaking out.
Time of the gentleman.
No, we're talking about
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan. And thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing here today. I'm just going to start going right down the line with a simple question. When a candidate campaigns for office, they make promises, correct? We'll start with you, Mr. Costello.
Correct, obviously.
Want to be a dictator?
Mr. Trustee, Mr. Hamilton.
Yes.
Yes.
One makes, wonderful. So I'm going to dig into what the prosecutors and plaintiffs have said about Mr. Trump here recently. Alvin Bragg, during his campaign for New York County District Attorney, said, quote, "I am the candidate in the race who has the experience with Donald Trump. I was the chief deputy in the Attorney General's office. We sued the Trump administration over 100 times for the Muslim travel ban, for family separation at the border, for shenanigans with the census. So I know how to litigate with him," end quote. In response to another question from a reporter, Bragg said, quote, "We've got two standards of justice. Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein. Being a rich, old, white man has allowed you to evade accountability in Manhattan. That includes Trump and his children," end quote. Moving on to New York Attorney General James, during the last days of her campaign, said of Trump, quote, "Oh, we're definitely going to sue him. We're going to be a real pain in the ass," end quote. She would later go on to say, quote, "I will never be afraid to challenge this illegitimate president," end quote, and said, "What is fueling," quote, "what is fueling my soul right now is Trump," end quote. Mr. Costello, is there a financial benefit to making campaign promises?
I'm sure there is, otherwise she wouldn't have made those promises.
Mr. Trusty?
I think that's right.
Mr. Hamilton?
Correct.
Ms. Winebanks?
I'm not sure I understand the premise of your question, so I
You
can't answer.
you cannot answer if there is a financial benefit to making campaign promises?
Making campaign promises is to win election.
You know,
I don't see that as a financial benefit.
I'm going to stick with you, Ms. Winebanks, as the Democrat witness here today. Can you answer how much money did District Attorney Alvin Bragg raise for his political reelection campaign immediately following the announcement of 34 felony counts against President Trump?
I do not know.
It's $850,000. $850,000. That's a good chunk of cash. Let's go on to the AG James. How much did she raise for her political campaign after her civil fraud case against President Trump?
I don't know, but it has nothing to do with whether the charges that she filed were based on the facts and the evidence and her
You and I
ability
both
to
know
prove
that's
them.
nonsense. Come on now.
I do not know that's nonsense. I believe it to
Not
be
a soul
true.
in this room actually believes that. And no one will ever believe that. It was $400,000. $400,000. And we will submit for the record copies of campaign emails soliciting donations. It almost seems, and I'm just stating the obvious here, that the harder they go after President Trump, the more money they stand to make. The common thread between all of these individuals, as well as the other cases that President Trump faces, is that many of the prosecutors suing Trump either have a personal vendetta or they seek to gain fame and money from it. This isn't hard. Those of us here today, we understand politics and what it takes to run a successful political operation. Traditionally, you want to drain your opponent's resources, drive up their negatives in the polls, and you want to keep them from engaging with voters. Now, I'm going to ask the million-dollar question here. What better way to do that than to charge your opponent with 91 counts, force them to spend millions on a legal defense, and tie them up in court to keep them off of the campaign trail? It's almost like this is a plan. This is a strategy that is employed in campaigns all around the country, but we are seeing it at the highest levels today. Of course, as an incumbent, you have an added advantage of using taxpayer-funded offices and agencies and officials, and we all know that you can never go up against the federal government because it is an endless stream of resources. Isn't that correct, Mr. Costello?
Without a doubt.
Exactly. If that is not what lawfare is, I don't know what is. Lawfare, by definition, is exactly that, utilizing the law to take down your political opponents. It is an abuse of power. Mr. Trusty, you said earlier a pretty chilling statement that you fear we have, quote, crossed the Rubicon, that the ends now justify the means. I feel like many Americans agree with you. Heck, if it weren't for double standards, I feel like our Democrat colleagues in this administration wouldn't have standards at all. But I feel that the credibility of our institution is at stake here because, to your point, the ends somehow have justified the means. You know, I've pulled some research out of a Harvard Law study that suggests that district attorneys pursue crimes and longer sentences at higher rates during election years. So while DA Bragg and AG James' terms end in 26 and 27 respectively, and of course DA Willis is facing re-election this fall, is it crazy to question whether any of these prosecutors are weighing their re-election efforts in their choice as they pursue President Trump? Final word to you, Mr. Trusty.
Right. It's certainly not crazy, and I think that there's evidence that supports that conclusion. And again, I never get to the money part. If you're a prosecutor, you're not supposed to be a politician. You're not supposed to announce your target first and then search for an inventive way to charge them with heretofore unknown crimes in a lot of cases. So that's the problem for me, is not chasing down all the politics of how they stand to gain, but that as a prosecutor, you have a sacred obligation to pursue evidence, not people.
Absolutely, a predetermined outcome.
Correct.
Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. My time has expired. I yield.
Well done. Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Texas, recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. This is so interesting. A couple of things. I'm just curious to know, as we're talking about lawyers and the obligations of lawyers, and whether or not maybe the former president has any idea of what good lawyer obligations look like. I'm just gonna ask, we're not gonna play, we're gonna do Miss Winebanks. Have you heard of any of these lawyers? I've got Robert Cheeley, Kenneth Chesborough, Jeffrey Clark, Matthew DePerno, John Eastman, Jenna Ellis, Michael Farino, Rudy Giuliani, Julia Halia. I got a long list. Have you heard of any of these people?
I have.
Are you aware as to whether or not any of them have faced criminal penalties?
Yes, and also been disbarred or suspended.
Oh, yeah, okay. So they've had some issues, but these are the hand-picked lawyers for Trump. I'm assuming that y'all have never been Trump lawyers, Mr. Trusty or Mr. Costello.
No, I was for a year.
Oh, you were, and you still have your bar card?
I'm sorry?
You still have your bar card?
Yeah, well,
You-
unless I get targeted for daring to represent a
listen,
former president.
You have absolutely done a lot better than most that deal with him. So good for you. I also want to make sure that we talk about what two-tier really looks like. And Mr. Trustee, since you've been a prosecutor before, I'm curious to know, have you ever had a criminal defendant that had over 80 counts in 4 different jurisdictions and somehow was not held pretrial? I know that you talked in your opening about your interpretation of what speedy trial looks like, and it's really only for those that are held pretrial. And last time I checked, most of the time those people held pretrial, they don't have anywhere near 80 counts pending against them. But I'm curious to know, in your experience, have you ever had someone that had over 80 counts pending in 4 different jurisdictions and they were not held pretrial? Yes or no?
Well, no specific recall,
Okay, all
but
right.
I could answer
That's all
more if you'll let me.
You told me no, and I understand because I hadn't either. So, in addition to that, there's been a gag order, since we're going to talk about the pending trial that's going on right now. Have you ever had a defendant that violated a gag order and then you went to the judge and the judge didn't lock them up and they done done it at least 10 times? I think it's 10. I'm losing count right now. Have you ever had somebody violate?
In 35 years, I had never seen a defendant gagged.
Okay, not my question. So you've never
Well, it's
had
hard
it.
to get to the second
you've
part if they're never
you've
gagged.
never had it. You're absolutely right. All right, so finally, when it comes down to intimidating witnesses, because maybe you haven't had gag orders, intimidating witnesses, have you ever had a defendant that you were prosecuting and they were intimidating witnesses and they didn't somehow end up in the clank for at least a day or two?
I've had criminal death penalty prosecutions based on witness retaliation. I'm very familiar with gang cases and mafia cases. Most of those defendants were already incarcerated when they would orchestrate some sort of obstruction.
Okay,
If
so
there's
they-
provable physical violence-based obstruction, it certainly makes sense that they'd be incarcerated.
Thank you so much. And, you know, Mr. Hamilton, I don't want you to feel left out of this conversation. So I'm going to make sure I ask you some questions. Let me know if you're having problems answering them, because they really should be yes or no. Let's see, you're the executive director for the America First Legal, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And America First Legal is a member of Project 2025, which is dedicated to creating the playbook for the next conservative administration and what it calls the Project Pillars, correct?
We are proud contributors to Project 2025.
Okay. And are you familiar with Project 2025's mandate for leadership?
In fact, I am.
Okay. And in fact, you wrote some of the sections of this mandate related to the DOJ, correct?
Sure did.
And the mandate outlines policy priorities for the next conservative president. Is that correct?
It does.
You've done a great job. I just want to let you know. All right, so let's walk through some of the provisions of the mandate. It calls for eliminating the Department of Education, eliminating the Department of Commerce, deploying the military for the use of domestic law enforcement against protesters under the Insurrection Act of 1807. It also has the repealing of Schedule F status for thousands of federal employees to allow a president to replace career civil servants with unqualified partisan loyalists. That's probably my favorite of it. It also prohibits the FBI from combating the spread of misinformation and disinformation, like Russia and China, who are actively trying to interfere with American elections. I don't know why or how anybody can support Project 2025. And I know that there was allegedly a joke about dictators and whether or not that's funny, but in the United States of America, dictatorships are never funny, and Project 2025 is giving the playbook for authoritarianism as well as the next dictator to come in. And I know that you are doing your jobs here by making sure that hopefully some juror turns on and finds some viral moment of you spewing more of the nonsense as it relates to the president. But as practicing lawyers or licensed attorneys, I hope that we can all agree that no one gets indicted because someone says so. There takes a grand jury, and the grand jury is comprised of American citizens that sit down and review evidence, and they make the determination. And when and if Trump is convicted, it will be a jury of his peers, and it won't be the President of the United States.
I thought you were going to get to a question somewhere in that 90 seconds for Mr. Hamilton after you went after his 2025. I will point out the Inspector General just released a report that said the FBI retaliated against whistleblowers. One of the reasons we do need some changes, but there was no question there. But Mr. Hamilton, if you want to give it some kind of response, you're more than welcome to do that.
Mr. Chairman, my only response would be to say that there are a great number of policy options that have been provided to any future conservative administration through Project 2025, and it's an attempt to restore the rule of law in this country. And I reject the Huffington Post-style characterizations of the recommendations.
All right. A gentlelady yields back. The
And
gentlelady from, we'll go to the gentlelady from Wyoming, then the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chair, I'd ask
Thank you.
unanimous consent.
Excuse me, this is,
I'll get you as soon as we go after this day. Just
Okay.
unanimous consent? Are you
Yes,
gonna-
just unanimous consent to enter the mandate for leadership.
Without objection. Without objection. The
Thank-
gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
well, thank you. And if it seems like there might be a dog in this hunt on the other side, what you need to understand is that Mr. Goldman, the novice representative from New York, actually does have a personal stake in this case. He has stated that he has been involved with the Bragg case, helping to prepare Mr. Cohen for his testimony. So he is quite closely aligned with an admitted and convicted liar and perjurer. He's also paid the Judge Merchant's daughter's firm over $150,000 for her services. So I think we've got quite a conflict of interest from Mr. Dan Goldman, the novice representative from New York. And just one other thing to keep in mind when considering the hostility from the folks on the other side of this aisle is that the ranking member
Excuse me,
of this
Mr. Chair,
particular
I would move
committee
to have that
was Jeffrey
stricken from the record,
Epstein's
to have
fixer.
that phrase taken down.
The ranking member was Jeffrey Epstein's fixer. So I think that might give you
Excuse
some
me,
idea of
I
why
would
you
ask
see this
that
hostility.
Hang on, the
statements be
gentlelady,
taken down.
gentlelady, the
to
ranking
Mr.
member is
Goldman.
recognized.
I would ask that the statements regarding the conflict of interest related to Mr. Goldman be stricken down from the record. Engaging in personal personalities
In your
on this
14-minute and 14-second opening statement, you called the former president, current candidate for the office of president of the United States, all kinds of names. I think
He's not a member of this committee.
I understand he's not a member, but
And
he's
that's what I'm
still
asking
a former
you
president.
related to.
What I'm saying is we should
I'm
all be
related
careful
to
about it.
our
I think
member.
the gentlelady from Wyoming was just stating facts that are in the news report.
She accused him of a conflict of interest on the committee during the hearing. I ask that that be stricken down.
Gentlelady's point of order is overruled. The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Hamilton, would you agree that gag orders on trial participants were created with the intent of securing a defendant's right to a fair trial and ensure efficient administration of justice?
It's precisely correct. And it's in fact usually intended to prevent the prosecution from making extrajudicial statements that are going to be prejudicial to the defendant's rights.
And Mr. Trustee, I think that you testified that in all of your years of experience, you've never seen a circumstance where a defendant had a gag order imposed against them. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And would it be fair to say that while such an order is intended to guarantee a defendant's Sixth Amendment right, it also at certain times could raise First Amendment issues?
It does.
Okay. In Bragg's political persecution of Donald Trump, Judge Merchant instituted an unconstitutional gag order against the defendant, President Trump. Yet Judge Merchant has levied no such order against any of the other trial participants, like Michael Cohen, who continue to publicly attack Mr. Trump. Mr. Hamilton, is the gag order issued by Judge Merchant a significant departure from the normal order of business, and does it reveal the First and Sixth Amendment tensions which underlie this case?
Most certainly does.
And why does President Trump face such a legally questionable gag order in this case? Well, simply put, it's because it is a classic example of lawfare being employed by Democrats against their political opponent, weaponizing the various branches and levels of government, something that we have seen in the last 8 years that has been absolutely shocking to the conscience. DA Bragg resurrected a zombie case and is using a novel legal theory which has not even been explained to the defendant or the jury. He selected Matthew Colangelo as lead prosecutor, a former Biden DOJ official and DNC consultant, and Judge Merchant, who made campaign donations to President Biden and the Democrat Party during the 2020 election, and whose daughter's firm worked for the Biden and now Harris campaigns, is overseeing the case and imposing speech restrictions on a person Judge Merchant called, quote, possibly the next president of the United States. Judge Merchant went so far in the last 2 weeks as threatening to jail a former president and presumptive major party nominee for violating an order which infringes on his free speech rights. Writing in The Federalist, Tom Christ analyzes how lawfare offers benefits and a means of victory regardless of the outcome of the courtroom, which is causing as much pain as possible and treating the defendant like an enemy versus the defendant. I want that to sink in. Watching Judge Merchant, it is very apparent that he is treating President Trump as an enemy, not a party and not a defendant. Mr. Hamilton, do you think the gag order falls into this playbook and serves an additional lawfare benefit for the left in that it can be used to enact an even larger legal burden on Donald Trump for simply exercising his right to free speech?
Yes, I do. And in fact, quite frankly, when you have a gag order like that, or when you have abuses of processes like this, as my colleagues have alluded to before, the pain in the process is the goal. That's really the goal here. Whether they get a conviction, whether they get any kind of civil fine or judgment, it's not necessarily the ultimate objective. The ultimate objective is to cause pain to the political opponent, and that's what they're doing to Donald Trump.
One of the things that I have observed as an attorney who was a trial attorney for 34 years, is that Judge Merchant is making such blatant reversible errors. He absolutely knows that if there is a conviction in this case, it will be reversed on appeal. And it's as though he is attempting to do that because he knows that no such appeal would actually take place prior to November, yet he would have a conviction on the books, which is the classic, and I think in this case exposes the way in which they are using lawfare against President Biden, or against President Trump. I have never seen a judge make the kind of errors that this judge has made in this case before. And I think he recognizes that if there is a conviction, it would be overturned on appeal. That is what our justice system has turned into because of the lawfare being waged by the Democrats. It has to end. Thank you for being here, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Now that we've finished with the novice Congresswoman from Wyoming, I guess that's what we're calling first-year members of Congress now, first-term members. I don't know where that came from or what that's supposed to mean. But let's move on. Instead of name-calling, let's just do the work that the people have us here for, whether we like individuals or not. Which sounds ridiculously immature. There was a discussion earlier about Jack Smith, and it was alleged that he is engaged in bias, partisan actions before. Is the discussion, I went and looked at some of the cases that he has, in fact, taken up in his long career, both in New York, Brooklyn, as well as at The Hague. Ms. Winebanks, are you familiar with former Representative Rick Renzi? He was a Republican member of the House that this Jack Smith prosecuted. Are you familiar with the name Senator John Edwards? He was a Democrat that Jack Smith also prosecuted. Republican member, Governor Bob McDonnell, when he was in the office of the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court of The Hague, many individuals from all world parties and leaders. Are you familiar, I don't know if you're familiar with an individual named Ronell Wilson.
I am not.
Ronell Wilson was an individual in New York who murdered 2 New York City Police Department officers. That was prosecuted by Jack Smith. He also prosecuted, however, police who brutalized Abner Louima. I'm sure you're familiar with that name.
I am.
So this is an individual who seems to be a prosecutor willing to go after anybody, no matter what their party is, if, in reviewing and investigating the information, they believe that that person has broken the law. And that's what I call a good prosecutor, having been one myself. Mr. Hamilton, are you aware that Chairman Jordan filed multiple amicus briefs in the case of Missouri v. Biden, now called Murphy versus Missouri?
I am.
And in fact, you are the attorney of record on those briefs, is that correct?
I am one of the attorneys.
Okay.
Correct.
Thank you. Were you provided access to the committee's transcribed interviews and deposition transcripts as part of the work and preparation of those briefs?
I was provided with, yes, information, absolutely.
And that included transcribed interviews and depositions?
I was provided with lots of information. I'm not going to get into all the details here because doing so would reveal the existence of communications between an attorney and a client.
Okay, that's fine. Do you, in your briefs, one of those instances of those briefs, you claimed that the FBI witness told the committee that the supposed Biden laptop was real, quote unquote, suggesting that the FBI had authenticated it. Do you recall that?
Do you have the brief in front of you?
Yes.
Could you read it to me? And I'll let you know if I recall it.
Okay, can you hold the time for me, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Thank you. Page 21. Is it which one? Okay. Reading from the brief on page 28, of the brief that's listed, brief Representatives Jim Jordan, Kelly Armstrong, Andy Biggs, Dan Bishop, et cetera, that was filed with the court on page 28. It states that, but of course the FBI knew not just the absence of evidence suggesting any foreign connection, the FBI knew the laptop was real. Do you recall that?
I do recall.
Okay. Do you also recall that when the individual stated, the witness later said that, suggesting that the FBI had authenticated it? However, that completely ignored the fact that the witness later said in that same transcription, that same interview, that anyone who claimed that the laptop had been authenticated would be, quote, misrepresenting her testimony. Do you recall her having said that?
I can't tell you today if I recall that or not.
Okay, so your brief suggests that one particular nonprofit, well, your brief then does not give the whole story by stating that the individual said the laptop was real from the FBI, misrepresenting that it had been authenticating, when she just meant that it existed, not that it had been authenticated. Do you know that difference?
Are you disputing the reality of Hunter Biden's laptop?
I am disputing your brief, which makes it seem that the authentication of what was in the laptop was there.
But so I'm trying to understand where you're going. Are you trying?
just asked
are
the
you
simple
disputing
question.
the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop?
I am disputing that it had
purpose of
been
your question of
authenticated
me?
by the FBI. Do you know if it had been authenticated by the
Whether the
FBI?
FBI authenticated it or
You said
not,
it
the
had. You
existence
said it
of
had.
it was authenticated
You
because
said
it
it
was
had
real.
in the brief.
You're getting into
You said it
word
had in the
jujitsu.
brief. That's the point. Moving on. I could go literally for hours. Your brief wrongly suggests that one particular nonprofit is in fact a government entity, and even includes a graphic from that nonprofit website that was cropped to omit language stating that the nonprofit is autonomous, meaning it's independent from the government. Literally on and on. It's just like this hearing of misrepresentations of the truth. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I would point out that last week the committee deposed Mr. Brady Olson, FBI agent, who said that at the time, October 2020, the FBI had no evidence that the laptop story was a hack and leak operation. No evidence. So they had done exactly what Mr. Hamilton described in his written brief. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just to...
Hang on one second, Mr. Stubbe, if you would. I understand you have a hard stop, Mr. Hamilton. We wanted you to be able to stay for, you know, any Democrat want to ask you a question. If you got to run, we understand. If time's now, Mr. Stubbe's.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so you're taking off? Mr. Hamilton's taking off? All right, so Mr. Costello, I'll just start at page 6 of your written testimony. I know the chairman got into what Mr. Cohen said about, I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything on Donald Trump. And then after that, so I'm at the end of page 6 of your written testimony, and I just want to walk through this. Through further cross-examination, Cohen told me that he knew there was money missing from the Trump inauguration fund, but that Donald Trump had nothing to do with it. Is that correct?
Where are you referencing on page 6?
I'm in your written testimony on page 6 at the bottom.
Okay. And you're referring to what again?
I'll just read it. Through further cross-examination, Cohen told me that he knew there was money missing from the Trump inauguration.
I see where you are now. Thank you.
Okay, and then on the next page, into that first paragraph, Cohen decided that while he didn't believe the allegation of the Stormy Daniels story, that he thought the story would be embarrassing for Trump and especially for Melania, so he decided he would take care of it himself.
Absolutely, and that is contrary to what this guy testified to in court in New York yesterday.
Well, and what's not being talked about is your next paragraph, like the reason and his motivation for that. So if you could just kind of walk through that for the committee.
Yeah, obviously, when we started to talk about the NDAs, and this is the very first meeting at the Regency Hotel, when, by the way, Rudy Giuliani was not involved in representing Donald Trump at that time. Cohen testified that it was a conspiracy between Giuliani and Costello as of this date. Totally false. In any event, he also said that he didn't discuss the Stormy Daniels matter with us, and he certainly did. I specifically asked him, because he kept on going back saying, I can't believe they're trying to put me in jail for these NDAs. So I said, Michael, tell me about the NDA. Tell me about Stormy Daniels. What did you do? He said, I got a call from a lawyer representing Stormy Daniels who represented that she was going to testify that Donald Trump had sex with Stormy Daniels. Michael Cohen said, I didn't believe the allegation, but I knew that such an allegation would be terribly embarrassing. He said it would be embarrassing. He focused on Melania Trump. He said, I didn't want to embarrass Melania Trump. He said, that's why I decided to take care of this on my own. I went back to that several times. You did this on your own? On my own. Did Donald Trump have anything to do with it? No. Did you get the money from Donald Trump? No. From any of his organizations? No. From anybody connected to Donald Trump? No. Where did you get the money? I took out a HELOC loan against my property. I said, why would you do that? He said, I didn't want anybody to know where I got this money. I didn't want Melania to know. I didn't want my own wife to know because she's in charge, he said, of the Cohen family finances. He said, if she saw money coming out of my account, she'd ask me 100 questions, and I didn't want to answer any of them. It was clear after talking to him for several days after that, whenever we talked on the phone or in my office, that he kept on bringing up the subject that he felt he was betrayed by not being brought down to Washington, D.C. This guy thought, he said to me, that he should have been Attorney General of the United States, or at least the chief assistant to the president. Ludicrous, but that's what he thought. And he was very angry about that. He wanted to do something to put himself back into the inner circle of Donald Trump. That's why he took care of this on his own. There had to be a motivation. Michael Cohen is always working for things that benefit himself. And that's what he was doing here. That's completely different to what he said that he told the grand jury. That's completely different to what he's testifying to in New York. Nobody has heard this side of the equation.
Right. Which is, I think, it's important that you're talking about that today. And I'm now on page 8, but just to keep, we're going to keep going from where you were in your written testimony. The point is, when Michael Cohen was presented with the opportunity to implicate Donald Trump in exchange for eliminating his own enormous legal problems, he repeatedly said he had nothing truthful on Donald Trump.
Yeah, why is that important? It's important because this guy literally was suicidal at the moment. He's saying, guys, I need you to tell me what my escape route is. How do I get out of this oncoming legal deluge that I see coming my way? And so I said, look, it's simple. If you look at what happened here, the U.S. attorney went to great lengths to get a search warrant for your law office. They had to go to Maine Justice. They think you have something. Remember, he's telling us I didn't do anything illegal. Counts 1 through 7 that he pled guilty to had nothing to do with Donald Trump. He said, I didn't do anything illegal, and I've been cooperating with the special counsel. I've been cooperating with Congress. Didn't tell us that he lied to Congress. I said, Michael, isn't it easier if you have something truthful, and I kept on repeating that, it's got to be truthful, don't make something up. If you have something truthful on Donald Trump, isn't it easier for you to cooperate against Donald Trump than it is to kill yourself? The answer is obvious. So when they claim that I was trying to shut up Michael Cohen, it's exactly the opposite. I was on that first day telling him, here's your escape route if you have truthful information, but he didn't.
And at this time, you were his attorney, which is why he made all these admissions.
Yeah, I mean, he makes these claims that we were never his attorney. I can show you emails and text messages and phone calls where he kept on saying, Bob, you guys are on the team, but I don't want to announce it now. He had McDermott, Will, and Emery going through documents here in Washington, D.C. He said, I don't want to announce it now. We didn't give him a retainer agreement the first time we met him at the Regency Hotel. We gave him a retainer agreement when he came to our offices. He came to our offices that he kept on saying, well, I can't deal with this now. The guy slow played us. There's no question about it. And I told the partner in charge of this, he's slow playing us. Get rid of this guy. He's never going to come up with the money. He's a bad penny. He's just going to keep on coming back. So it wasn't my call because it was his client, not my client. So that's why Michael kept on calling me, and I was giving him the advice that I should have given him all along, truthful advice. Nobody was pressuring him. I was giving him the straight facts as I knew them.
My time's expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd yield to you.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Trustee, 17 years at the Department of Justice. Did the raid on Mar-a-Lago follow normal process?
I don't believe so.
You know who agrees with you? the assistant FBI director of the Washington field office, because we deposed him. And I just want to walk you through and say if what you saw squares with what Mr. D'Antuono testified to in a deposition in front of the committee. The Miami field office did not conduct the search. It's folks from Washington who came down and did the search. Is that unusual?
I would think so. You normally have at least some local component.
The department did not assign a U.S. attorney to head up the investigation. They ran it out of the field office. They ran it out of Washington, D.C. Is that unusual?
Well, I'm not sure it's unusual for DOJ attorneys to kind of assume authority in a vacuum. So, my understanding is Jay Bratt was involved from day one, and that continued through the search warrant, obviously.
Right, but normally wouldn't a U.S. attorney be assigned to it in most cases?
Yeah, and eventually they would show up for court, but I don't think at that part of the process they were an active partner.
Did the FBI seek consent before they conducted the research, or the search?
No, actually, the last thing that President Trump said when he allowed FBI agents in Mar-a-Lago in June was, anything you need, let me know. The only communication that came from DOJ after that was a request to put a padlock on the door where they knew the boxes were. And then the next thing we know,
Which the president complied with.
Which he did immediately, and 2 months later, there's a search warrant.
And then did the FBI wait when they got on premise, had it secured, did they wait for President Trump's legal team to be there and accompany them on the search?
There were requests by representatives of President Trump to be, in the vicinity of the search. Those were denied. That is a right of law enforcement. They don't have to. But for a case of this historical precedence, consistent with my earlier remarks, some transparency, some openness would have been probably a valuable moment lost here.
Yeah, no kidding. Talk to me about, in your testimony, two other things. You mentioned the 14th Amendment. I mean, this to me struck me as just absolutely craziness, that they're going to go to state courts and try to keep the president off the ballot. Tell me your thoughts on this crazy concept.
Well, the Supreme Court unanimously agreed to end the nonsense of the disqualification litigation, but they never really reached the due process, which would have been a hornet's nest of going state by state and saying, how did they conduct these expedited trials? The fact that always grabbed me, and maybe this goes back to having a bad sense of humor, was in Colorado, they literally put a sociologist on the witness stand to say, when President Trump said, go peaceful and patriotically, I know from my Ouija board or whatever else he consults, that he really means be violent and attack the cops. I mean, that was considered admissible information in a hearing designed to take a presidential candidate off of a ballot. So I kind of wanted the Supreme Court to get the due process and join me in laughing at that, but they never got there.
Yeah, what he said, I've concluded, means exactly the opposite, and the court accepted that as evidence. Thank goodness the Supreme Court said 9-0, this is crazy. I want to read you one other thing from your testimony, which I just found amazing, and you briefly touched on it earlier. You said, if this is a grand jury situation, in the grand jury, the prosecution said to Mr. Parlatore, if the president is being so cooperative, why won't he waive his attorney-client privilege? The fact that they asked that question in a is, again, maybe as crazy as the whole 14th Amendment argument.
Yeah, I mean, again, nothing I'd seen in 35 years, and it was an over-aggressive moment of asking the grand jury to draw a negative inference from a lawful invocation of attorney-client privilege. That's just black letter unethical for a prosecutor to do.
Yeah, scary, scary stuff that we see going on, all to go after their political opponent, and we could go on with example after example. I mean, the one before where dangling the judgeship in front of a lawyer representing, when you got Jay Bratt and the DOJ there, is just, I mean, again, we could go on and on. I want to thank you both for testifying, and would yield back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
I thank the chairman. I thank our witnesses. I regret that I didn't have the chance to dialogue with Mr. Hamilton, but I thank you guys for being here and staying a little longer than we thought the hearing would run. Look, one of the most influential books that I've read is a short book called The Law by Frederick Bastiat. He was a French philosopher in the 1800s. He predates Karl Marx, and he was addressing the socialists. So they were already trying to weaponize law. His book about the law was, in fact, all about how the law was corrupted and perverted from its proper use of defending freedom and property rights
to a form of corruption, legal plunder, as he termed it. One of the quotes from the book is, he says, "When law and morality contradict each other, the citizen has the cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or losing his respect for the law." And I think that's where the American people are. They see that the law has been corrupted and perverted. They see, at best, a two-tiered system of justice. One of the most common questions probably every member of Congress gets, certainly when I talk to my closest friends, we all get this question: Congressman, when is someone going to jail? Now, to be fair, when the Democrats ask it, they want to know when a Republican's going to jail. And when the Republicans ask it, generally they want to know when a Democrat's going to jail. But the reality is people are seeing that there's one standard that they would be held to and another that's being applied to others. Political enemies, overwhelmingly. Political rivals. It's the weaponization of law, lawfare. And the tip of the spear of this is Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump, they mocked when he said that they were spying on his campaign. Lo and behold, they were spying on his campaign. They said that the Russia collusion thing was all fake. They funded a $30+ million investigation into Donald Trump with the Mueller report, and people still think that's what he was impeached for. It was a nothing burger. No crime, no action. In fact, to the extent there was a crime, it was done by firms like Perkins Coie that rigged this whole hoax. It was against our national intelligence community that weaponized their trusted position in the intelligence and law enforcement community to spy on the presidential campaign of Donald Trump. Now we see election interference in a different way in this campaign. We've got a case where we've seen, whether it's Alvin Bragg, Letitia James, others, that campaign on a platform for election of going after Donald Trump. Fani Willis raised money off of her criminal case against President Trump. Finally, Mr. Costello, I enjoyed your dialogue, and would you agree that these prosecutors are, in fact, politically motivated in their targeting of Donald Trump?
Without a doubt.
You think about the case in New York, Alvin Bragg's case. I mean, what is the crime? And to the extent there was a crime, how does it relate to Donald Trump? Could you elaborate?
Nobody knows what the crime is. They've taken a misdemeanor, which is barred by the statute of limitations, and tried to turn it into a felony by saying the misdemeanor was used to cover up an additional crime, the felony. It's hinted that the felony that they're trying to cover up is election interference. Election interference for the 2016 election. They claim was caused by false entries made in 2017. Now, how do you influence a 2016 election with 2017 allegedly false entries? They say, because I was puzzled by this, it's a conspiracy. Really, said I. I went and I pulled the indictment. There's 34 or 38 counts. No conspiracy count. One defendant, Donald Trump. It's absurd.
The whole case is, but yet, in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that the world sees through this, we're all wondering whether or not we'll get a not guilty verdict to the extent we get a verdict. We don't trust that the law is actually going to be administered impartially. We're not sure that you could get an impartial trial of his peers, a jury of his peers. And this is the thing. Our criminal statutes are designed to protect the defendant. We've seen a clear abuse of the law. We've seen, as I point out, nothing new under the sun. And, you know, it's not like Bastiat was the first person to discover this. We've seen the first thing, basically, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. Because humans have a hard time with that, we started appointing someone to be the judge. Who was the one in the right? Who was the one in the wrong? People see through this, and they're going to see it on November 5th. And I just trust that this country is worth defending. And I applaud the people that are standing up against injustice. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Well done. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here's what I think is abundantly clear. The Democrats will do and are doing everything in their power to keep President Trump off the ballot or from winning. Nothing is off the table. Things I'd never imagined or even thought were remotely possible are now happening in the United States of America. You name it, and they're doing it. They're taking the decision away from voters by outright stripping his name off the ballot. Of course, the Supreme Court rightfully intervened there, but you had unelected secretaries of state, unaccountable judges making these decisions. They spied on his campaign, as we've talked about. They abused FISA, fabricated documents, and relied on a paid-for campaign dossier to spy on his campaign. Again, falsely alleging that there was some Russian collusion, which has been debunked over and over again. And the most egregious yet, we have not one, not two, or three, but 4 politically motivated cases that are happening all around the country. Again, it's to keep him off the campaign trail, it's to smear his reputation, and it's to drain him of resources. This is a targeted, this is a meticulous effort and a plan of attack to usurp the will of the people. Again, at the expense of our own institutions. That's what's most troubling to me as a lawyer, is that we're using Article 1 to attack him. We're using Article 2 to attack him, and now we're using the courts. These local prosecutors should be focused on cleaning up their streets, cleaning up their communities, stopping people from getting shot on the subways, and prosecuting real crimes, for goodness sakes. But we don't have that here. We have Donald Trump, right? Let's go after him. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record an article by America First Policy Institute called Progressive Prosecutors Abusing Their Power.
Without objection.
You know, in Georgia, Fannie Willis brought charges against President Trump immediately when he announced his reelection. I guess there's so much bandwidth in her jurisdiction that she can take taxpayer-funneled vacations with her lover and ignore real crime that is happening because there's just not much to do in Georgia. But that kind of belies the case. We have, she oversees, quite frankly, according to this article, a top 5 Georgia crime capital with a rate of 30.5 crimes per 100,000 residents. In 2022, larceny was the highest offense in Fulton County with 19,509 thefts recorded. Alvin Bragg waited 5 years to criminally indict President Trump on 34 counts of falsifying business records. And again, going around the statute of limitations to create some weird, nuanced, and novel way to prosecute an alleged crime. Not to mention he hired the former number 3 official in Biden's DOJ who has been paid for by the DNC to be a top prosecutor of the case. Meanwhile, during Bragg's first year as DA, data showed that conviction rate, Mr. Costello, you would probably know this, of only 51% for serious felony charges. That's not really good, is it? A conviction rate at 51%?
That's awful.
And misdemeanor convictions went from 53% down to 28%. I mean, I would think that would be like a fireable offense if I was electing somebody to be my prosecutor.
That's true. And the governor of New York could do that, but she hasn't.
You know, our rule of law, I think, needs to be restored. And I'm deeply troubled by the ways in which Democrats are attacking the institutions of our country, and of course, our former president of the United States, who is now running and is the lead candidate and the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party. I introduced this Congress the No More Political Prosecutions Act, which would allow someone like President Trump to remove his case in state court to a federal court at his discretion if he wanted to. Why might that be important, Mr. Trustee?
Well, I think as we're seeing play out in front of us, there's political bias that's demonstrated before people are even in office, and a desire to carry the torch against President Trump in this case, maybe get a few visits to the White House along the way. And ultimately, it's the genie getting out of the bottle. I mean, the reason why that, and I haven't studied your legislation, but the reason that concept makes sense to me is because maybe it is the tip of the spear, but there's a whole spear behind the tip. And the very people that are okay with politicized DOJ may be feeling very differently 5, 10, 30, 60 years from now. I think we're at that pivotal moment where we have to take action to reform the lawfare that's taking place around us.
Right, in the case of Alvin Bragg, right, he campaigned on going against President Trump, is that correct?
That's my understanding.
And in fact, I think one of our colleagues on this committee, Mr. Goldman, fundraised for him in that effort. And so now we have a case that apparently, again, there's no crime in the District of Manhattan, and we're going after President Trump. Why would jury pools be a reason why this legislation might be important? The jury pool in Manhattan as opposed to a federal court? What are the differences and why might that be attractive to somebody who has served our country as president or vice president?
Well, it's a wider net when you have a federal jury pool in terms of who the base of folks are. And what you're looking for is not a perfect microcosm of the United States at any given moment. There's, I've tried cases where we had people from the eastern shore of Maryland and the western parts of Maryland, and then all points in between. So you get all sorts of different philosophies and backgrounds. That's understood. But
And
when you
oftentimes,
have,
and I'm limited to the last question though, oftentimes too, the voir dire process in federal court is much more robust than state court. Might that be attractive to somebody who's served as president? Or
yeah, it tends to be a pretty rigorous process. I've had death penalty prosecutions where weeks were spent picking a jury. High-profile defendants are going to have probably more protection, general rule, but more protection going through the voir dire process in a federal case.
Thank you, Mr. Trustee. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. I just want to pick on one quick thing, and then I'll give the ranking member a chance to say something before we close our hearing. But I was struck by what you just said there a few minutes ago, Mr. Trustee. You said talk about the tip of the spear, but there's a spear behind the tip. And I always remind folks that the mob is never satisfied. Right now, there's people saying, the left is saying go after President Trump. We think it's ridiculous what's going on. But they'll come for everybody at some point, and we have seen the examples. Slightly different context, but the cancel culture mob a few years ago said Dianne Feinstein wasn't even good enough for him because she said something 35, 40 years ago, and the Dianne Feinstein Elementary School in San Francisco is no longer named Dianne Feinstein Elementary School because of something she said 40 years ago. So the mob's appetite to go after whoever they is never, ever satisfied. And that to me is the larger point. What they're doing to President Trump is so wrong, but what it means for all of us, the 330-some million in this country, what it potentially means for any and all of us is what scares me the most. Ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief this time. I know that we have some attorneys here who have had storied careers in their work. One of them, Ms. Weinbank, stated that she believed that former President Trump is a more existential threat to our democracy than Richard Nixon was. And when I look at some of the statements that President Trump has made, and we're concerned about DOJ, the Department of Justice, where I was so honored to be a member of that team, with individuals who, when I got there in 2001, had been there since Robert F. Kennedy had hired them as honors graduates from law school. Just an incredible place. But we have a president who I don't think it's a joke when he says things, or humorous, when he says things like, I will appoint a real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in history of the United States, Joe Biden and the entire crime family. Or if he says, if I happen to be president and see somebody who's doing well and beating me badly, I say, go down and indict them. When his own former chiefs of staff and others say that he is going to be a threat to this democracy. If we don't want to talk about Trump and we don't want to go after him, let's use this committee time to shore up those agencies that are in fact going to be there as guardrails to ensure that all of us are treated equally under the law. And I yield back.
There's a reason all 4 cases are falling apart. It's because they were ridiculous cases, never should have been brought. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Weinbanks, thank you. Mr. Trustee, thank you for your good work and your outstanding testimony. Mr. Costello, the same for you. We appreciate you taking the time to share the truth with this committee. And with that, that concludes today's hearing. We thank our witnesses again. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.